You're listening to the Deus Volt Radio Show because God wills it. Here are your hosts, John Michael Samick, Josh Johnson, and as always, the pastor of disaster, Ken Zitch.
Good.
Yeah, so as far as like the debate, I mean, I'm ready to watch it just for the entertainment value, not for the academic value, because there will be none of that.
Well, of course not.
There'll be none.
I mean, you have Joe Biden, who's on his, if he's not on his deathbed, he's ready to be put into clinically insane asylum.
Or nursing home. I mean, the thing is, he just doesn't look so good, you know, and he's supposed to be leading the country. I mean, if he just said the other day when he entered the Senate 180 years ago, and I mean, that's a pretty bad gaffe too. He's getting numbers really, really wrong. So, like, all the time.
Let me be a conspiracy theorist here.
Oh boy.
Okay. What if?
When are you not a conspiracy theorist?
Let's not get personal here. Yeah, some people's kids are just way out there.
Yeah, somebody needs a spanking.
Spanking, yes.
Says Papa.
Disrespect and all that. But anyway.
Excuse me.
Let me be.
I'm not a child. I'm an adult here.
Yeah, well, you're
a hairy child.
You're a hairy child.
How dare you?
A bearded baby.
You got.
Hey,
What?
drink your milk, baby.
But let me
watch it.
Let me speak here just for a moment. Offer my 10 cents or maybe even 5 cents.
2.
But 2. Okay, 2 cents.
0.1.
What
0.000.
Shut up. Would you please?
Apparently, that's how much Trump paid in taxes, according to the news.
You can't even keep your phone from going
Kenneth,
off in the middle
we're sending today's final debate live stream list in 2 hours. President Trump wants to see your name first.
Ooh.
My God, I'm going to be there.
Put your name there, Pastor. Go ahead.
But anyway, yeah. Let me be a conspiracy theorist here for a minute. What if you knew basically that you really didn't have any chance at all of winning an election unless maybe you come out as a dumb old guy at the beginning of the campaigning and stumbled and stuttered your way through to the point where it's the end of September and beginning of October. And what if maybe you come out in this debate tonight and you know your stuff and you're ready to debate? Would that be a game changer?
A surprise.
How is that conspiracy theory?
I don't know. Well, it is that
it
he's not
is.
really. He's been faking it all this time.
Faking
no,
it all
he's not
this
faking
time.
it. His eyes.
That's
are
a conspiracy
glassed over.
theory?
He doesn't look like he's all there anymore.
Well,
Well, no. Well, a lot of people.
if he's faking it, I mean, come on. He's making a real ass of himself.
Pretty good. But even Joe Biden in his top form, though, I don't know if he could take Trump. But once again, I don't want to lower expectations. I want to go with Trump, that he's had 40-some years of debating experience working for the Senate and not getting anything done. And that on top of that he's probably on performance-enhancing drugs. Did you see Trump here? He's like,
wait. The Biden is?
Biden is, yeah. Trump's like, I want a drug test before. I want a drug test before and after the debate.
That's pretty good. I like that.
Wait. Where'd you hear that Biden is on performance-enhancing drugs?
Trump said it. Trump said he's on performance-enhancing drugs and he wants some drug tested before and after the debate.
Well, why do you say he's on performance-enhancing drugs?
Because that's the only way with his dementia he'd be able to get through a debate.
Yeah, but see, my problem with this all is that I can hardly believe.
You see, Ken, this is your problem, Ken.
I can hardly believe.
This is your problem. You see, I am the greatest at what I do, Ken. Ken, can you wait a second, Ken? I'm trying to talk here.
Are you talking to me on the thing here?
Okay.
Yeah, hold on. Let me see if you're talking to me.
You're fired.
Yeah, we're fired. But anyway, I can hardly believe that.
Believe it, I'm Trump.
Yeah, that they're going to. No, I can hardly believe that they're going to send Biden out there tonight to be thoroughly humiliated by Trump. Something.
I think they
I
had
don't
no choice.
believe that. I don't buy that. I think that there was plenty of ways to get out of the debate, and the fact that they're sending him out there tonight kind of worries me a little bit because I think that this might have all been a setup. I believe it.
Well, as long as he has a pulse, I mean, they're going to say he's the winner. So, because the expectations are so low right now, everybody's expecting him to go out and be like, yeah, when I was a boy, I used to ride giraffes. And, and when I was in the Senate 180 years ago, I did a lot for people, especially Corn Pop, who I fought with him one time back in 1967. And speaking of which, that was that time we had that trade deal. It worked out for Pennsylvanians. Right, so they're expecting him to do that when he goes out and debate. So if he does better than that, like they're going to say he won.
Wait,
So-
isn't Biden the one that said, "Oh, if you're a coal miner, don't worry, we can find for you a job. We can find a job for you doing computer programming.
Yeah.
No problem." Isn't Joe Biden the one that said, "If you're a black person and you don't vote for me, then
You ain't black.
You ain't black."
You ain't black. That's what he said. Yeah.
I know.
Why are you so worried about? What do you think? They got AI chip in his brain. He's like a robot.
He's
out
like a
there.
beer.
I am Joe. I new Joe. Joe 2.0. Trump, you won't stand a chance.
Let me clear the fog for you here a little bit. You both are in a fog, and that
boy.
is that here's the deal. Here's the deal. These people that are backing Joe Biden have one aim and one aim only, and that is to perpetuate their debauchery on the rest of us Americans. And if you don't know that, then you don't really know what's going on here.
Then you ain't known diddly.
Yeah. And the thing is that these people will stop at nothing. Nothing. And that's even deception on the highest level. They'll stop at nothing to win this election. The thing is that if you're a Christian, this is not what it has always been in the past. It is not that. And if you think it is, you're living in dream world.
Well, but these people are also delusional too.
Yeah, I understand that.
Remember what happened in the last election, and Hillary's gonna win by a landslide, and there's no chance that Trump could ever win. These people don't really know the minds of the ordinary, down to earth.
Do you think that the Biden
American
campaign is going to be able to use the whole $750? He only paid $750 in taxes. That's going to gain any traction anywhere?
No.
No.
To be honest, I think that at one time, even with blue collar voters and the
Why would
Rust
it
Belt-
matter?
Well, I think for blue collar voters at one time it would have, because they associated Republicans with big corporations that were anti-working class. But when Trump basically came out and he goes, "Hey, I didn't pay any taxes because I was smart. Like, who wants to pay taxes? I don't want to pay taxes. Do you want to pay taxes?" Like, he basically hit it right on the nose, and everybody was like, "Yeah,
come
hell
on.
yeah,
That
no,
makes
I don't want to pay
sense, right?
taxes either." Because the thing is we pay taxes because we have to, and we don't want to
Yeah.
be thrown in jail or shot
Yeah.
or anything like that. But no
Yeah.
one wants to pay it, and you shouldn't punish people for wealth. And so, taxing like that is like stealing. And so the fact that he got stole from less is something that should be applauded.
Listen, if I was a billionaire and I could get out of paying taxes by donating money or
Legally, remember. Yeah.
legally,
Yes.
by donating money or giving money to charitable causes, or other ways, I would do the same thing.
Yeah, I think the thing is, when Scripture talks about rendering under Caesar, and it talks about paying taxes. The thing is, with that, we have to pay taxes because we use the king's money. You use the king's money, you pay the king's taxes, and we are under threat by whatever state that we are under if we don't pay those taxes. So I think it's prudent for Christians to pay taxes, just like I think it's prudent for someone who's being robbed with a gun to your back. Yeah, you hand them the wallet. You don't sacrifice your life for the wallet. And, likewise, you have to understand, too, is that this system that we have is beyond like even the warnings for tyranny that you see in Scripture. It was tyranny if you were taxed more than the tithe, more than 10%, and we're talking about huge margins of taxation. You know, not only in the United States, but all over the Western world, which is predictable on the road to socialism.
I mean, I just pay my school taxes.
Yeah.
Oh,
The whole thing,
Not fun.
the whole thing with the taxes is just a smokescreen.
Well, of course it is.
The reason why the tax issue came up last night was because of the fact that President Trump announced his pick for the Supreme Court, Amy Coney Barrett. That was to divert people's attention.
I wanted to start a fight with Pastor on this one.
to divert
Picking a woman.
his attention to divert the people's attention to Trump's taxes instead of the pick. You know, in some quarters, the Amy Coney Barrett nomination is
What do you think of her?
Slam dunk. Do you want me to answer that because you want to start an argument?
Yeah, kinda. Just we don't want to get too sidetracked here, but I will go ahead and just poke a little bit. Okay, from a historicist perspective. Okay, Amy Coney Barrett is a Roman Catholic. And not only a Roman Catholic, but she actually said that she would recuse herself from any ruling where the Pope has spoken on it directly. Did you know that?
wow.
So if the Pope speaks on a particular moral issue that's coming up in the Supreme Court, she has claimed that she will recuse herself from the case.
Well, let me lay your heart at rest, my son.
Yeah.
Yes, my holiness.
I'm absolutely.
He is the Pope. Dun dun dun.
Pope of Hope.
The Pope of Hope.
But anyway, yeah, Earl gave me that name.
I like it.
But anyway, I am no fan at all of the Amy Coney Barrett nomination. I'm
You just said it was a slam dunk, though.
well. It was. I said in some quarters. It was
Okay, sure, fair.
I said in some corners. If you don't know my position on women in churches and even women in government,
First blast of the trumpet.
let me tell you right now that
This is
I'm not an
second blast.
egalitarian. I'm not a complementarian.
He's a John
I am a
Knoxian.
patristic,
Yeah, patriarchal, baby.
patriarchal.
Long
yeah.
live the patriarchy.
I don't believe
Bring
that
back the
women
patriarchy.
should be in positions of government. I don't believe they should be in positions of authority in the church.
Yeah.
I believe all of this is embarrassing. It's an embarrassment. And the thing is, the way I look at Amy Coney Barrett is that if she gets nominated, then we can look at this as a national embarrassment, not because of her or her skills or anything like that. We can look at this as a national embarrassment because in the end, and this happens in the church more often than not, you know how you have to pick a woman to be a pastor because no other men will be there to do it?
Sure.
Well, in my opinion, Amy Coney Barrett will get elected or nominated and approved for the Supreme Court because there was no man to stand and do the job that needed
Well,
to be
I don't
done.
know.
Well-
Here's my only criticism for that. I think the reason that they were picking a woman was because of political expediency.
I know that. That's
and
what,
to replace
that's-
RBG. Yeah, but I don't think
Yeah.
it's because there weren't men available. Because I think that if other
Yeah.
men had been asked to
Yeah.
fill,
Well,
the-
let me ask you this though:
Okay.
if you say there's other men available, Kavanaugh was an awful pick.
Mm-hmm.
Why didn't they pick some of those other men before
Yeah.
they picked Kavanaugh? I mean,
Yeah, well, I don't
the
think
thing
Trump
is, what
went-
about Gorsuch? Gorsuch is an embarrassment too. I mean,
Correct.
these are the guys. I think Gorsuch is the one who ruled that transgenderism
Correct.
is a civil right.
Well, didn't
And
Gorsuch was
Yeah.
sold to us though as better than Kavanaugh, as going to be the most conservative justice on the bench. I believe he clerked for Scalia as well, if I'm not mistaken. And even if he didn't, he was considered an originalist with a good record. Thing is, if you're going to look to the state to solve our problems, you're always going to be disappointed.
Oh,
And the thing is, with these Supreme Court justices, it's the same thing. The founders also never intended for the Supreme Court to have this much power. Alexander Hamilton actually thought that the judiciary would be the weakest of all three branches when all said was done, not the most powerful.
Well, boy, was he wrong.
Yeah, well, a lot of people were wrong, but they were wrong in general to think that the Constitution was going to prevent the kind of system that we have, because it didn't. And it was inevitable, and that's of course going to be part of the article that we'll be discussing today, which was the third and final pillar of paganism, which was
Neo-paganism.
of the new paganism, of any paganism, which is a king like the nations. The idea of a social contract.
Well, let me say this before
go
you
ahead.
go there. in my opinion, the way to resolve the situation with the Supreme Court is to just ignore their rulings until they start ruling in a constitutional way. That's what we need to do. Just say we're not listening to what you're saying. The opinions you're rendering are completely off base. They're not in line with the Constitution, and we have no reason to take you seriously.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think unjust laws are no laws at all, but then you would have to, but there's certain specifics you would be asked on that might be a little bit tougher row to hoe. Like, for instance, the individual mandate. Okay, let's just assume for argument that had been upheld by the Supreme Court, that everyone has to pay the original mandate, where you have to pay, you either have to get health insurance or you have to pay a fine to the state. Okay, so that's not a constitutional thing. You know, it goes against the Commerce Clause. Justice Roberts' ruling on that would have been viewed by anybody as unconstitutional. It's regarded by most conservatives as one of the greatest betrayals in the Supreme Court ever. But, you know, are you going so far to say that basically if the IRS requires you to pay a fine to them by the original mandate, that you would tell people just ignore that?
No.
I mean, that would be the implication.
No, I wouldn't do that. I think you have to pay the fine. I think you have to pay the fine.
Yeah,
I
but
think,
that's
I
not,
think I think you have
that's
to
not ignoring, though. That's not ignoring a ruling coming from the Supreme Court because of its unconstitutionality. That's submitting to it. That's a difference. You know, because if we're going to ignore it, then we would ignore the unconstitutional request that we pay that fine. That's my point. Like, if we're gonna say that we're not going to heed the warnings of a court, I mean, we got to mean it.
Well, the thing is, you have to understand how the government today is trying to manipulate our culture, and they do it through tax law and stuff like that.
Mm-hmm. Sure.
You know, the thing is that, you know, you have to make some sacrifices here and there. You have to be willing to go to the meal for your beliefs. But the thing about it is that in the end, if you're filling out a tax return and the tax return says, do you have health insurance? Your answer is no. And it says that you have a fine to pay because you don't have health insurance, then that really has nothing to do with, you know, what you should and shouldn't. You have to pay the fine. It's on the tax return. Mm-hmm. It's like any other.
I'm not disagreeing with you, but that's my point. The reason you have to pay the fine is because we're acknowledging the Supreme Court ruling.
No, we're acknowledging the right. We're acknowledging that Caesar has the right to impose taxes on.
That's fine. Well, I'm not disagreeing with that at all. I'm not saying that you shouldn't pay your taxes, but if we're saying that we're going to disregard Supreme Court rulings because they're unconstitutional, well, that's just simply not true if you pay all your taxes, because that individual mandate wouldn't exist if it wasn't for an unconstitutional ruling from the Supreme Court, namely regarding the ACA and John Roberts' defection.
Yeah.
So I'm just saying if we're going to use the words that we're going to tell people to disregard rulings coming from the Supreme Court, that would be an implication, is that we don't pay the individual mandate because we're not acknowledging it as valid.
But the only way that rulings from the Supreme Court could be discarded in our present context is if Congress said we're not going to listen to we're not going to listen to this ruling the Supreme Court made on this topic because we believe that it's wrong, and so we're going to go this direction. The problem is that Congress has been so inept over the past 20, even more years. Congress has done absolutely nothing because it's been, half the time it's been divided over a plethora of issues, so it hasn't been able to do anything and get anything done. And that's what, that's really the failure of this government system, is the fact that you have three branches: executive, presidential, Congress, okay?
Executive, legislative, and judicial.
Yeah, executive, Congress, which is legislative, and judicial, which is Supreme Court. And the executive, the two branches that are supposed to have the most balances, checks and balances, okay, are the executive, and then checks and balances because the president just can't put laws into play, but now he can through executive orders, okay? And then the Supreme Court, because the Supreme Court, their check and balances, they can't just make any decision they want to. They have to make their decisions or make their court decisions they have to agree with the Constitution or the laws that have already been made.
Precedent.
But they can do, but they've bypassed that as well.
Right.
They've been able to do whatever they want to do, and that's because Congress, the body that's supposed to have the most power and the most ability to make laws to have an effect on the country and the way things are shaped and formed, because they're the ones that are voted in by the people. Supreme Court's not; they're not voted in by the people.
Sure. But the thing is, the founding fathers never anticipated that the Congress would actually get rid of a lot of its power, and because a lot of the powers that the president has, for instance, they were delegated by the legislature. So the legislature gave up power and increased the power of the executive branch.
Well, that's the point.
And also, it's through the legislature that you had court packing with activist judges, and so that the Supreme Court no longer rules based on the Constitution. Not only that, but the idea of ruling based on judicial precedent, not based on the original document of the Constitution. To be honest, I don't really consider that originalism or textualism when you view judicial precedent as still having a primary factor in your decisions. I think that's crazy. But beyond that, at the end of the day, the founding fathers failed to create a system that worked. You know, the thing is, the claims that it would work if we had done it differently. The thing is, we didn't do it differently.
Yeah.
The idea was that this was supposed to be checks and balances against man's lust for power, to manipulate the system to create institutions of tyranny. The Constitution and the powers that it delegated to these three branches, these three co-equal branches of government, there was supposed to prevent this from happening, but it didn't prevent it. So basically, it always comes back down to this, which is one of my favorite quotes from Lysander Spooner, which is that, either the Constitution authorized the system we currently have or was powerless to prevent it.
Yeah, but see, Josh, the thing about it is is that what you're talking about there isn't just it isn't what's the word It isn't just to the United States government that this is there. Every government that's ever existed in human history has been overtaken by corruption.
Correct.
That's the reason why human government is. God said to the Israelites at the beginning, "Why do you want a king to rule over you? There is me." What the king is going to want to do, he's going to want to take your donkeys, he's going to want to take your sheep, he's going to want to take control of your daughters, he's going to want to tax you, he's going to want to do all of these things. And see, the thing is that what this is more or less like a red pill. A red pill that's been built into every human government that's ever existed. There isn't any government that's exempt from
a red pill. Red pill is usually a good term. It's a term meaning that people who are converted to conservatism have been red pilled. Yeah, it's a reference to the Matrix.
Yeah, well, that's what I mean. The thing is, but we're using it here in a negative sense.
Okay, sure.
And that the red pill is that in every government, there's this tendency toward corruption, and it's going to happen every time. It doesn't matter whether it's the United States government. It doesn't matter whether it's a
100%.
democracy. The thing is that the founding fathers of our country did the best job they could do. But
I agree.
But they couldn't help the fact, basically you have to admit that with regards to everything that's going on in our government right now that shouldn't be happening, the reason why it is happening is because basically people are ignoring the intent of the founding fathers.
Yeah, well, I would say that the founding
They're
fathers
ignoring
intended to have a king like the nations, but they wanted to have it to be the least bad of that option. So, this is what the objection of the Scottish Covenanter was, that the United States, when it formed, it didn't acknowledge Christ in its constitution and try to establish a Christian government with an established Christian church. Besides those criticisms, at the end of the day, the essence of the thing that I would definitely still agree with them on is that they had a chance to start over from scratch and have God rule over them directly. But instead, they decided to go the king of the nations route. And instead of, having a literal king like a monarchy, they decided to go back to older forms of government that were held to by the nations. And when I say older, I mean older as far as like what the West had been using. They, instead of holding to monarchy or aristocracy or principles of complete individuality and independence, like these are all different ideas that were championed in different places in the medieval period. Instead, they wanted to go back to something called the social contract. And this is why the social contract in the Kings of the Nations, a passage from 1 Samuel chapter 8, I kind of use those terms somewhat equivalent, because a social contract is just the basis or the justification for the government that manifests itself. It doesn't really say anything about the form of government. And the reason I want to make this contrast is because I would argue that the Christian system is opposite in many ways of the pagan system or the non-Christian system of government. Mm-hmm. Even when it comes to the one form of government that the two have shared historically, which is monarchy. But monarchy is criticized in Scripture, but the monarchy that happened in Israel versus the justification for monarchy that the pagans had is slightly different. And the main difference is covenantal. So you have a social contract as contrasted with a individual covenant. So social implies like a group of people in a contract together, not a formal contract like a normal contract between me and you. Both parties are acknowledging the information in the contract, we're agreeing to the terms, and we're both signing it. It's a conscious action by all willing participants. That's how a normal contract works, and that's actually how a covenant works too. Covenant and contract actually have overlap, especially in older uses of English.
When you're talking about that, let me ask you a question. Sure. Isn't all forms of government based upon some kind of contract?
Well, this is the question. Now, people that make that claim is that everything is based on a social contract, but no,
I'm not talking about that. I'm just talking about
willing.
About don't people inevitably agree to governing authorities to govern over them, and then whether it be a king or whether it be your Senate and your Congress or whatever, but still. In that regard, isn't government by nature a covenant?
No.
Covenantal relationship?
No, because I was never asked to agree to the terms of the United States government and to all its laws.
But you were never asked or you agreed to the terms of being a Christian either.
No. There's difference, because when I went up to take communion, I was. When I went to go take the Lord's Supper, I was asked certain things. I couldn't just join St. John's without agreeing to certain things. Mm-hmm. That is covenant. So, and same thing in the Old Testament covenant. Though you're baptized into the covenant, you have an age of confirmation where you're confirmed in the covenant, where you agree to the terms of the covenant.
You have to make a confession of
I'm not
faith.
saying that you can do that of your own ability apart from the work of the Holy Spirit. I am a monergist after the Augustinian and Lutheran tradition. So you can't, no one would ever agree to the covenant that God has presented apart from God's work of the Holy Spirit first changing them to agree to the terms.
But it's a covenant nonetheless.
But it's still a covenant because everybody involved has agreed to the terms of the covenant. Yeah. The social contract.
Don't you agree to the terms? I don't mean to interrupt you.
No, go ahead.
I want to work our way through this.
Sure.
Don't you agree though to a certain covenant with a government that you make as you go along and you start acquiescing to the statutes and the laws? First of all, you go and you get a Social Security number when you're real young.
But what if you don't?
You don't have to do that. But you do that. You don't do that for yourself.
I'm not saying
your parents
that's my
do
point.
that for you.
Sure. Go ahead, continue the point.
But I'm saying you do. Whether your parents get it for you or not, you go into work. One day you start working and you start agreeing to have Social Security tax taken out of your paycheck. You agree to have withholding tax taken out of your paycheck. Mm-hmm. When you get laid off from work, then you go to the unemployment office and you start collecting unemployment.
Well, here's a good question. Can you agree not to pay taxes?
Sure you can.
No. Is there a penalty for it?
Huh?
Is there a penalty
you
for
don't
not
have the
paying
option.
taxes?
If you figure out, and this is the key, you figure things out the way that they are and the way that they're supposed to be. You can go through people go through their life all the time without paying taxes. There's a guy online who does it. I mean, you gotta know what you can do when you enter into the system of not paying taxes. Then you have to know at that point in time that you're going to be extremely limited like there's issues with regards to your social security number, like a driver's license and stuff like that. I mean, you take all of these burdens and hardships on yourself. But yes, it is possible to go through life without paying
okay,
taxes.
but I think you're missing the point. My point is that can you openly talk to the government and say, I don't want to pay your taxes, I have not agreed to them, and that would be okay? That's not true.
No.
That wouldn't be okay.
Well,
you'd be hit with tax fraud. You'd be punished.
Respectfully, I push back on that, and I don't understand what your willingness to do it. If you don't want to do it, you don't do it. If you want to do it, you do it. The thing is that you can't really say you're forced to, because I've demonstrated already that you can go through life without paying taxes if you want to.
Yeah, but under that argument but if you're saying that, then you're saying
You've
that
said that you can, but you haven't demonstrated.
Oh,
how
I
you can.
I can show you the places where people do it.
Okay, but is that
quite
considered
common?
Yeah, but is that considered
Quite common.
fraud, or is that considered morally legitimate?
It's morally legitimate if you're living, if you're not asking the government. I can see it as being morally legitimate if you're not asking the government for anything in return.
I'll be honest, I've never heard anyone say this before, or a pastor say it. I've never heard anybody say it.
Yeah.
But
well, pastors did it when they opt out of Social Security.
well, that's great.
The thing is that there's all kinds of ways to say I don't want to be a part of the system and I refuse to be a part of the system.
I would encourage people to do that. I guess my point is, you asked if a government is a contract. So a contract, by what most people mean a contract, is like when you go and buy a car or you enter into a business relationship with somebody. Okay, that sense of contract is not what is assumed by the United States government when it talks about a social contract, or what the philosophers of social contract mean. What they believe is called implied consent, which philosophically, I would argue, is a contradiction in terms. Implied consent is that without ever giving your consent, your consent is implied by being born and living in the area that's under the control of the United States government. And then you seem like you're kind of flirting with the idea of this thing of implied consent, but you also seem to argue that consent is explicit because you don't have to pay taxes if you don't want to, which is not the normal understanding. The normal understanding is
when I
that-
say you don't have to pay taxes, let me be clear. The law says that you should pay taxes, but the thing about it is that there's people who don't pay taxes.
There's people that go to jail for it
part
too,
of
though.
the system. Yeah, there's people that go to jail for it. But the thing is that there's people who are willing to pay that sacrifice in order to not to do it.
That's
Okay,
fine,
but
but
the
that's not
difference-
what I'm saying, though. That's what I'm saying is, if you choose to not pay, here's the thing: if taxes were part of a contract if it's a true contract, which means you don't have to sign the contract. That means if you chose not to acknowledge the United States government as your government, you wouldn't have to pay taxes. So it would be impossible for you to be fined or go to jail because you've never agreed to the contract. But that's not how the United States views its citizens. It doesn't view them as willing participants in a government. You consent to pay taxes.
Yeah.
In exchange, you get certain rights and privileges from the United States government. No, it says that,
not like that.
in virtue of living in this country, you have to pay taxes. And it's against the law if you don't pay taxes. Yeah, sure, there's people that get away with it. Some people are arguing Trump is one of those people that got away with it. But the question is it part of there's a handshake moment here with you and the United States government that you said, hey, I agree to be a citizen of this country, and I agree to pay certain taxes in exchange with certain rights and privileges.
Okay, well,
it's like-
we've talked about exiting. We've talked about here exiting the system completely. Okay, let's move away from that for a minute. The thing is that there's I guess you could call it, I'm not sure if this is the term, but there's implied consent.
Yeah, that's that's the term I
And
use.
the thing is that there's implied consent in that, in those ways that, okay, let's say that you really don't have to get involved with the system, you do.
Yeah.
And the thing is that demonstrates that you're content to be here and to be a citizen of the United States. So therefore, you have entered into some kind of an agreement.
Okay, but I
with
would
the
say no.
government.
Yeah, but see, you would have to prove that. First of all, implied consent
there's no
is
agreement. You're not entering into any
No, no, no.
agreement.
Yes, sir.
This is my point, though. An implied consent is a contradiction in terms. Because, for instance, that's like saying, well, I was talking to this girl, and she seemed like she was friendly with me, so I had sex with her. Okay, because it seemed like implied consent. She never agreed to it. She never said it was okay. But I decided to have sex with her anyway because it seemed implied by the fact that she had been speaking and spending time with me.
That's
Okay.
a little bit.
No, the reason I'm
That's
using
a
as an
little bit
example,
far removed
yeah,
from
but
what we're
whoa, whoa, whoa.
talking
But we're
about.
using two different terms here. We're saying implied and consent, where you're speaking as if the two can go together without a contradiction.
When I say-
I use another example to show that that doesn't work.
When I say implied consent, I'm not talking about forcing your will on somebody else and taking advantage of them. I'm talking about actions that you take that suggests that you're content being a part of the system.
Yeah, but who determines that? Me or the United States government determines I've given implied consent?
Well, the only determination, the only kind of determination that you need in that regard is if you're demonstrating that you're willing to participate in the system.
How would you do that?
Huh?
Like how?
Well, like say for instance, you get Social Security when you retire.
Okay, well,
Okay,
so you had a choice not to pay Social Security
Right.
tax?
Well, the thing is that just because you had to pay Social Security tax, if you really believe that the government shouldn't be supporting you, if that's your belief, then you won't.
Well, see,
Collect Social
yeah,
Security.
no.
You're
But
confusing me.
But you could make the argument that if they took Social Security from you in your paycheck, that it's fine for you to take some of your money back by claiming Social Security because they took it from you in the first place.
That's my argument.
Well,
yeah,
I would agree
yeah.
with that.
That's
But
my
that's
argument,
not
yeah.
an argument of implied consent at all because they took money from you, but they also gave you an opportunity to recoup some of it. That's like the thief saying, okay, well, I stole
How
50
did they
bucks
do
from you.
that?
Well, let's say a thief stole $50 from you. Okay. He says, I stole $50 from you, but do you know what? To make you not feel so bad about it, you can reclaim some of that $50 if you agree to continue to pay me these $50
Yeah.
thief fees for so many months. So if you pay by gunpoint, you don't have a choice. If you want to work here, you have to pay this money to me. Okay. So if this thief does that, he says you have to pay me $50 a month. Okay. But if you promise to pay these $50 a month, which you really don't have a choice anyway, because I'll shoot you, or fine you or jail you. After this certain term of you paying me this $50 a month without agreement, I promise to give you $25 of it back when you're old and you can't honor this agreement anymore. I mean, that's basically what they're doing. Because you say about being part of the system, working for someone else. Like if I work for him, how's that being part of the system? He's an individual. I'm an individual. I've made a contract with him. And the state comes in and says, okay, because you paid an income, you have to pay us out of your income. Not that the income belongs to the state, but the state claims it anyway. You don't have a choice. If you make an income over $600 a month, you have to pay taxes. That's
Let
the
me
law.
ask you this:
I never agreed to that.
Can't you say when you get to be of an age and you begin to realize all of these things about government, can't you just say, I don't want to live here anymore?
Yeah, where are you going to go? To another social contract
Oh, I
government
don't-
influenced by the
I
United
don't-
States? Well, you can't. If you went to
But there's still the idea of you're saying, okay, I'm going to live in this country and I'm going to take advantages of the benefits that it affords me. And in that sense, and maybe I'm wrong, maybe this is what the
Well,
problem
I'm not
is.
making an argument in depth. I was just talking about the history of the social contract. But you want to talk about, whether
Well,
or
you
not
said about a covenant, and that's what I'm.
Yes, I'm
that's what
differentiating a covenant from what like a king like the nations versus a relationship that we have with God in the scripture. God works through us through covenant.
And I guess my only point is that really my only point in this is whether or not you agree or disagree or whatever you do. My point is that there's no government in the world that works.
I agree.
I mean, it doesn't
for the very
work.
point
It
you're
just
bringing
doesn't
up that
work.
you can't escape them.
Right. I
You
mean,
can't.
no matter what you do.
Yeah,
because
because the kings. Because all the Christians in the West betrayed Christianity and said, you know what, we will rely upon a state. So we created bloated states all across the West that are worse than ever in the history of the world, as far as size, debt, military expenditures, and the amount of people that they kill and the amount of taxes that they exact. The Western world, for all the praise that can be heaped on upon it, which the only good things that came out of the West were because of Christianity anyway, and all the bad things were because of its government system. The government system that the West founded has not been a beacon of freedom. It's been a beacon of some of the most sophisticated forms of slavery the world has ever seen.
We have to ask, where is the government supposed to originate? What anyway? Where is the government supposed to properly originate? And I think
governance, true governance,
we've-
comes from God.
Well, yes, but in what group on earth has God placed the government or governance to originate, to start out in, and that's the family.
Yeah.
That's the family. The problem today, the problem with social contract governance, and the problem with our governance is it removes power from the family. Because now the public government has the right to tell you, come right into your house and tell you how to raise your kids, tell you where to send them, tell you where to send them to school, tell you that you have to send them to school, tell you, that how you can discipline your kids, and tell you a variety of other things relating to raising your children.
Yeah. Well, and I agree with all of that. And I agree that the family is one of the first things that are sacrificed. I mean, this was the whole thesis of Sir Robert Filmer in his book, Patriarcha, which is the one that John Locke responded to. Patriarcha was a defense of the divine right of kings. But his argument stems from the headship of Adam over the family, and that the family structure is God's intended structure for governing all communities.
Yeah.
And that the monarchy is an extension of the family, and the landed aristocracy is an
it
extension
makes-
of the family.
I
It
agree
makes
with
sense
all that,
because
but-
the only community that you have no choice of that you have no choice where to belong is your family. You have no choice You were born to your mother and your father, and until you are an adult, you are underneath the
And that's what I'm
authority
saying.
of your mother and father.
And that's what I'm saying. There's the only one that you
But
don't
the state
have a
is
choice.
not your mother and your father.
I'm not saying it is, John Michael.
Okay.
I'm just saying that you have a choice with every other system of governance except your family.
Yeah.
You do have a choice, and I'm not arguing against what you're going to say about social contract. But what I'm saying here is that we can't. It sounds to me like what is a way for people to exempt themselves from doing the right thing, in that they can say, well, I was born in the United States. I had to live here. I had to do. No, you don't have to.
No, but you shouldn't have to leave.
You don't
like
have
if you were born
okay,
here
you
in
don't have to
Pennsylvania.
leave, but you're right. You don't have to leave. I was just saying that. I was just using that as an example at that point in time. What I'm saying is that you don't have to do the things that God tells you not to do.
Oh, I agree. We're in 100% agreement.
Yeah, we don't. You don't
No,
have.
we're in the same
And you
agreement on
have an obligation. Yeah, you said that we need to explain things. What I'm saying here is you have an obligation to look at what anyone's telling you with regards to anything, whether it be the government or whether it be science or whether it be whatever. It's your responsibility to make sure that you're doing what God says you should.
Yeah, and I'm not
doing.
absolving that. When I'm talking about,
Yeah, that's what I was worried about, was
No. All I'm talking about is the difference between a social contract and a covenant. In a covenant, all of the parties privy to the covenant have at some point in their lives laid claim to what is said in the covenant and say, I agree to this and I bind myself to that agreement.
Okay, well, let's get that straightened out.
That is not what happens, though, when you are a United States citizen. That
Let's
is
get
not
that
the process.
Let's get that straightened out, because we have had, and we can agree on a common definition here. But for me, social contract is when a group of people come together and they have determined that this is the way they're going to run their community. For instance, like in communist Russia, Russians, the Bolsheviks, came together as a group and they decided that they were going to rule over Russia in this way. And in my opinion, that's a social contract.
Yeah,
Are we
democracy.
talking about the same
but
thing?
democracy is also social.
no.
No. Yes and no. Okay, so when people come together to form, like for instance, when the founding fathers say that, it is the will of the people, right? The right of the people, right? To institute their own form of government. Okay, it is the right of the people to institute their own form of government. That statement
That's
is
the
social
founding
contract.
fathers.
Yes, that's
Okay.
from the Declaration of
Like, because
Independence.
who's the people?
Okay.
Yeah, it's
The people it's making governance public.
Yeah, public ownership of
But
the
let him
of
finish
government.
his point here.
Instead of making it private, it's got to be. Go ahead.
Yeah, well, basically, what I'm saying with that statement is social contract theory. It is the right of the people to institute their own form of government. Okay, now when they institute that form of government, when it says we the people, the group that does so, there's different ways that manifests itself. Under Hobbes, he says the group of the people came together in ancient times because in a state of nature, man just kills each other. It's just everybody's like violent cave people with big clubs beating up each other, having to run away from saber-toothed tigers and what.
Lawless society.
Yeah, and so what happens is, according to Hobbes, is that these people came together and they instituted monarchy. Now this is
Who's
Hobbes.
Hobbes?
Hobbes was
Tell
a
me the book.
Philosopher.
Yeah, Leviathan
Yeah.
was his most famous work.
Is that okay?
Yeah,
Leviathan.
so yeah, Hobbes is Leviathan, and then Leviathan, and that's his. He uses the biblical term Leviathan, which refers like to a giant monster.
Is this the government he's referring to? That
Yeah,
can
he's
become
he's
a
speaking about
Leviathan?
and he talks about it praiseworthily.
Okay.
He says that people come together to create the one. So it is the will. For instance, when our founding father says it's the will of the people to institute their own form of government, Hobbes would say that the form of government that the people instituted was monarchy. He says the people came together and they wanted a king. So the authority of the king comes from the people, according to Hobbes, because it was the will of the people to have a king. And so, which just sounds exactly like what the Israelites did with regards to Samuel. The people
So would you say
wanted
that
a king
the
like the
United
nations.
States, the United States population, in assenting to the Constitution, then their king was the president, the House of
No,
Representatives, and the Senate?
yes. The king was the totality of the government that they
totality
chose.
of the government?
Yes. So when they had a king like the nations, in this case, that these people, the will of the people was a tricameral constitutional federal republic. Okay, that was the system that the people instituted in the case of the United States. Whereas in other places they instituted monarchy, some instituted democracy, and it is the will of the people to institute the form of government. Now that is contrasted. That's social contract. So once again, it's not the form of government.
Okay.
Because
That's what I needed
monarchy, democracy, republicanism, all of them can be justified under a social contract theory.
Okay.
It's where you believe government originates from is what a
Okay.
social contract claims. And the idea of implied consent, that by living here, you've consented to, just by living here and participating and being alive, you've consented to the form. That is what social contract assumes. So when it says that
Well, have you done that, though? That's what I was asking you before. Have you consented by continuing to live here?
Yeah, but see, no, I would disagree, because
Okay.
if the land is given to you by your father, for instance, let's say you inherited from your father.
Oh, I see.
Your
Okay.
right to be here doesn't come from the United States.
Okay.
Your right to be here is established by
You have a right to your, land.
family.
you have a right to your land, you have a right to your family,
All
and
right,
it doesn't matter who's claiming to reign over you right now.
Constitution doesn't grant rights.
So those who are here that own land, their ownership of the land transcends that of what the government thinks.
Yes, and to be honest,
Yeah,
our government actually claims that anyway, because our government claims that
Yes,
these rights were retained by the
inalienable.
people. Yeah, they're inalienable from God.
Okay.
So they've said that technically your right to property, you have that right to that property whether the United States exists or not.
Okay.
The founding
even
fathers,
though they infringe on them.
Yeah, the founding fathers said that the United States was only to acknowledge the rights that you already had.
Okay.
But even though they don't practice that now,
Yeah.
because they've gone consistent with the social contract and have now turned to the consistent view, which is that it is the social contract from which your rights originate,
Like the First
will
Amendment.
of the people. So the founding fathers were like, as a check, they said you have to believe that these rights come from God, which is consistent with the biblical view of government. But
Well, let me ask you another question before you go on with regards to this social contract thing. If that's the contract that we agreed to, and would you say that the Constitution then is the codification?
yeah,
of
our
what-
form that the people of the United States chose for themselves. But I'm
Okay, well,
criticizing
today
the whole
when
thing.
people are doing things like the government is overstepping its authority and doing things that it shouldn't be doing,
Mm-hmm.
shouldn't we be permitted to say, well, we're just not going to?
Well, it depends. Is your opinion as Pastor Zitch the will of the people? Because if the will of the people decide to institute communism, they will.
Well, wait a minute, Josh. Do we allow the will of the people to override our principles as Christians?
No. I'm not.
No.
I'm not
Okay,
defending
well,
this.
I'm
No.
wanting to
I'm not
understand
defending this.
here.
No, I'm not
Okay.
defending this. I'm
But the government is-
criticizing the United States. I'm criticizing
Yeah.
the United States government and as any social contract. To me, United States government, communism, fascism, they're all species of the same monster, as well as oppressive monarchies that the kings, they're all the same thing. They all originate from this belief that people have the right to institute their own form of government. That's the right that I'm criticizing, because that's not a right that comes from God, because God gave us a form of government through his word and through the church.
Well,
and
what I'm
through
saying is that
patriarchs.
you as a citizen, when you see the government overstepping the boundaries that it has committed itself to in the Constitution, don't you have a duty and an obligation not to obey?
Sometimes you don't
as
have a
Christian,
choice.
As a Christian, I would say that Christians shouldn't obey laws that are contrary to the Word of God.
No, I mean, what about the law of the land?
Yeah, I'm not. As far as being a citizen of the United States, I don't feel like I had any choice in that matter. As far as being an American, I'm an American because I live in America. This is my homeland.
Can I speak on this? I mean, I lived in a state in Nevada where there was no income tax. Okay. So the no state income tax coming, versus other states, Pennsylvania, New York, where there would be an income tax. What you're telling people to say, so is it better? Okay. So I would say it's better that the state doesn't have an income tax, doesn't tax your income. Okay. So Nevada is much better than Pennsylvania, but I don't really have a choice. If I'm going to work at a job, okay, I don't really have a choice.
Well, the reason why you don't have a choice,
To
though,
not
John
pay-
Michael, in
to
that
not pay
respect, is
income
because
tax.
Jesus said,
State income tax.
Jesus says that when they said pay the taxes, Jesus told them to get out and get the fish, and they took the coin out of the fish's mouth, and he says, "Give to Caesar what Caesar's, and give to God."
Wait
what is
a
God." When you're
minute.
talking about taxes.
Wait a minute.
You have a responsibility
minute.
to pay the taxes.
Wait a minute.
Yes,
You're
of course. Paul
wait a
reiterates
minute.
that in Romans 13.
Wait a
too.
minute. Wait.
Go ahead.
You're mixing up two different scriptures.
All right, tell me where I'm mixing up here.
You're mixing up. They're not even the same text.
I'm talking
The one
about your
text-
responsibility to pay taxes.
The one
is
text,
what I'm talking about.
But you're
I mean,
you're diluting two texts. Okay,
You lived in
the one
you,
text.
you lived in was it Utah or Nevada? You lived
Nevada.
In Nevada.
Yes.
You lived in Nevada.
Yes.
They didn't pay an income tax.
Yes.
You moved to Pennsylvania. They do
Well,
pay an income tax. You have to
yes.
pay the tax.
Yeah,
So-
what I'm saying is you don't have a choice. Okay, and the texts that you brought up are not valid. Number one.
I'm not talking about.
We're
text
derailing.
here.
We're derailing
Yeah, you're
here.
going offline
Yeah,
here.
I'm
talking about.
Well,
I'm talking about your responsibility to pay
but I'm
taxes.
trying to address.
Okay.
Trying to address.
But that's my point, though. Under the form of government instituted by God, other than the tithe, there was no taxation. Okay, because the form of government was not a social contract, and that's the warning in 1 Samuel 8 that taxation is a judgment. This is what you get when you choose a king like the nations.
When you choose a king like the
taxation
Wait,
is a
but
punishment.
the tax where okay.
Go ahead and talk about that text. Go ahead about the,
Please,
Go ahead, just do it.
because
I know you want
because he's just wrong there.
Okay,
No,
go
I'm
ahead.
done.
Yeah, you are because
well, explain. No,
The
no,
one
don't
situation,
explain
the one
yourself.
situation. There's one situation where they're going. Jesus and Peter are going to the temple,
Mm-hmm.
and Peter says to and they have to pay a tax in order to get into the temple.
Mm-hmm.
And Jesus says to Peter, "Well, do you think that sons should pay a tax to go into their father's house?" And Peter says, "No." And Jesus says, "Well, okay, but in order to just appease them,
Wait a
go
minute.
down,
Where did Jesus
go
say
down to the
You
river?"
think you have to pay a tax to go into your? Where's that in Scripture?
Oh, it is. It's there.
it
That's the text that we're talking about. Yeah, he does. That's exactly what he says.
What I'm talking
he says
about
to
here-
Peter, he says, and then the other text.
I don't
they're
care
two-
about
they're
any
two
of that.
completely
I'm
different. They're two completely different situations. One tax that Jesus is
I'm
referring
talking
to
about
is
whether
a
or not
temple
you pay
tax. It's
taxes
not
or
the
not.
government tax. It's not a government tax. It was a tax that was initiated by the Pharisees for the temple in order just to get into the
Yes,
temple.
that text. But the other text
The
he's
other
referencing
text
is the
now,
Roman text.
Yeah, it's
now
a
the
Roman
other
tax.
text.
Yeah, thank
but the
you.
other text, Jesus was not saying. He was not saying to pay tax. Okay, he was saying he never said that.
Can
he
we
said,
agree? Can we
"Give to
agree on
Caesar
this?
What is Caesar's?
So we can go
and give
on
to
here.
God
Can we
what is
agree
God's."
on the fact
That's
that
what he
Jesus
said.
says in the Gospels, you have a responsibility to pay your taxes?
No.
Well, I disagree.
No. But see, you guys are misunderstanding. John Michael's not arguing that Christians shouldn't pay taxes ever, and that's not what he's saying. And here's the thing: what it says in the text is to render unto Caesar,
Caesar
what is
is
Caesar's.
Caesar's.
Okay, so what does that mean? Because they were trying to trap him.
They were
right?
trying to trap him.
I don't know how well you know this
It's nothing to do with
text.
taxes.
But the text is actually was, bring me a coin. Because why did the Pharisees try to trap him? There's a couple reasons. The Zealots were in rebellion against Rome, and they said that they didn't have to pay Roman taxes, especially because it had the insignia of Rome, which was idolatry on it. So the zealous Jews, the Zealots that wanted to keep Israel independent from Rome and denied Roman rule, they argued that Jews should not have to pay any taxes at all. And because of that, they were outlaws. There's another group, the Sadducees, namely, and the Sadducees argued that they should be integrated. We should accept Roman and Greek religion and customs. They didn't believe in the afterlife, and they believed that the Caesar had authoritative rule, and they willingly paid taxes to the Roman Empire. So those are the two extremes. And one of them was viewed by the common Jewish people as betrayal, and the other one was viewed as against the law by the Romans. And they were trying to trap Christ, because the two positions that he was going to be trapped between, according to the Pharisees, was either the Zealots, where you say, I'm not going to pay taxes and thereby be a rebel in the eyes of Rome, or you concede and be on the same side as the heretics, the Sadducees, and willingly accept Roman rule over Israel. Christ did neither. He says, if you're going to use the king's money, you have to pay the king's taxes. What coin is this? And that's why
my
it can.
point.
Yes, but here's
That's my
what. But
point.
that doesn't say that. But we have to differentiate. There's a differentiation between paying taxes because you have to, or because you're using the government's money that they print and they issue, and whether or not taxes are a good thing in general, and we pay them because they're good things.
Well, no,
'Cause
Jesus,
they're not.
but Jesus never said give taxes. He said give to God, give to Caesar what is Caesar's, and give to God what is God's. And on the coin was the picture of Caesar, and on and either above or underneath the picture of Caesar was basically saying Son of God. You know, so they're trying to trap Jesus, because if Jesus says, well,
Yes.
yeah, go ahead, pay taxes, they're going to say, well, you're violating the first commandment
Yes,
because
which
you're
is why the
telling
Zealots
us
didn't do it.
to worship Rome. And if Jesus says, well, don't pay taxes, then they're trying to put him between a rock and a hard place. If Jesus says don't pay taxes, they're going to say, well, are you telling us that we should violate the law of Rome? And that's why Jesus does not give a direct answer, because he knows
did give a direct answer.
He knows what they were trying to do.
He did give a direct
Not
answer.
really.
It wasn't-
No,
it wasn't-
not really.
He said, "Show whose head is it on the
Yes.
coin?" He said Caesar's. Jesus
Yes.
says, "Give to Caesar what is Caesar.
Yes.
Give to God what is
Correct.
God." And Josh has already said that whenever you take the king's money, you pay the king's taxes.
But even what
That's-
Caesar's is
that's-
God's.
that's
but
what-
even what Caesar's is God's. So technically, you know, you could interpret that, and I think it's properly interpreted in this way. Give what is Caesar. What is Caesar's? Okay. Well, what is God's? Everything, including Caesar's. So we're to worship God first. And
Agreed.
if Caesar sees himself as God, we're not to obey him as such.
Yeah, well, there's no disagreement on that. But
Does that mean that
to
we walk
answer-
around as rebels? No, but
in Romans 13, you would pay taxes, but for the same reason, I would say Christ argued that we pay taxes. If you're going to use, I'll give me an example from the United States. Okay, if you're going to use dollars, okay, if you're going to use currency printed by the United States Treasury and you have it in your possession, and the same treasury requires a percentage of it back, then you give a percentage of it back. Right. And once again, but the percentage that you require, first of all, but there's a couple of things here. First of all, that taxation is still a judgment, because at the end of the day, God says taxation is a judgment. You want a king like the nations, they're going to oppress you with taxes.
Yeah, that's
and if you had
no question.
Yes, and if you had God's form of government, you wouldn't have such taxations, which just gets to my point. Okay, taxes, what makes a tax different from the tithe is this. The tithe is voluntary, because at the end of the day, you agreed to the covenant obligation to pay a tithe. Okay, when you take the Lord's Supper, okay, in the church, or when you became a man and partook of Passover in the old covenant, you've said, I take upon the covenant for myself that was declared either at my baptism or my circumcision, and I as an adult here now say, I am obligated to the terms of this covenant, so I will obey the law of God, or be subject to its punishments. I will pay the tithe. I will do whatever religious obligations I am required to do, and I acknowledge at the end of the day that nothing that I can do is of myself, but only because of the grace of God. That's basically what happens with a covenant relationship with God's form of governance. Right. When you have a king like the nations, even though you are considered to have implied consent by being in the land under the governance because the people chose a king, the kids of those people that chose Saul, they didn't choose Saul, their offspring, but they put basically that decision on future generations. They shackled, they imprisoned their own offspring. They said, we're binding ourselves and our offspring to a king like the nations. They don't get a chance to go back. And this is kind of the point of this, is the judgment that comes with having a king like the nations. It will oppress you. It will take your sons for war. It will take your wives for their harems. They will oppress you.
And I agree with that 100%.
Yes, because it's built into the system. Right. And so, but Christ isn't endorsing or embracing, pagan statism. All he is saying is this, is that if you are going to use the king's money. Yes. And just like in Romans 13, it's because there's also a danger there. If you don't do what the government asks you, you also are risking your own life. And there are times when Christians are called to do that.
Now, let me ask you a question before you go on. Mm-hmm. We agree then that when you take the king's money, you owe the king taxes.
Yeah, what he requires any of it back.
Okay. So,
but here's the thing. If you didn't use his money, you wouldn't.
By using the king's money, mm-hmm. Okay, haven't you at that point in time, even if you didn't enter into the covenant, the social contract, don't you at that point in time when you use the king's money, it's like, what is it?
You're using the term
no, because you have no choice.
Yeah, because the thing is you're going along with the use of the king's money, so therefore you're assenting to the covenant.
Yeah, but here's
you're assenting to the contract.
Yeah, but here's another argument though, that it also talks about the mark of the beast, and I don't want to get into eschatology and historicism and preterism or any of that, but I just want to remember what the text says, about the mark of the beast, right? That you'll neither be able to buy or sell without it. Right. Okay. Now I'm not. Like I said, I don't want to get into a discussion of who the Antichrist is, but there's an important principle behind this: is that governments will try to restrict your ability to use anything but the currency that they issue. Okay, so at that point, when you have a monopoly on the currency and you are coercive saying that you have to use the currency, that's not what Christ is legitimizing. He's saying that if you are in a situation where if you're willingly using the money and the same person who's giving you that money issues back, you have something that doesn't belong to you, basically is what Christ is saying. If you have dollars in your pocket that are issued by the U.S. Treasury, those dollars belong to U.S. Treasury. They just issued them. And so if the U.S. Treasury wants some of that back, you have to give it back to them. But that's not legitimizing where a situation either, though, where a state says this is the only currency you can use. You can't barter. You can't use gold. You can't use silver. You can't make agreements, you see, because that's the issue with the mark of the beast, is that they prohibit you from using anything else but what the government issues. And this is part of the point, though, is that these forms of governments that we're talking about, these social contract governments, they do that inevitably. They're not going to be like, okay, well, you can use the U.S. dollar or you can use your own gold and silver, because we saw what FDR did with that. We saw what happened with the different acts in the early 1900s regarding our use to be able, because the founding fathers didn't think that there should be a national bank that issued currency. Right. They believed banks should issue their own dollars individually. Right. So one bank, CNB Bank in Pennsylvania, could issue literally its own type of dollar, its own current currency. There wasn't a U.S. currency. The situation that the Israelites were dealing with was that Rome took over Israel, defeated Israel, and implemented and issued its currency there. And and if people in Israel wanted to buy and sell, they were using Roman currency if they were under Roman authority. And so, the Zealots actually issued their own coinage. I don't know if you knew that. They actually had Hebrew, and it had a symbol of the lampstand. It had all of that on the coin. The Zealots issued their own kind of currency. And see, Christ isn't invalidating what the Zealots were doing either. All he's simply saying is if you have something that belongs to Caesar, give back what he requires of you. Do you know what the solution is for that people don't want to admit to? That technically you would still be honoring what Christ says in that passage if you gave up using US dollars at all and used something alternative. So if you were able to make all your payments in Bitcoin or gold and silver or by bartering, you are under no obligation to pay taxes to Caesar, because that doesn't belong to Caesar.
Goes back to what I said before. I mean, the thing is that you don't. In the end, mm-hmm. the reason why people stay in the system is because they're afraid. The thing is that you don't have to stay in the system.
Agreed.
If you don't want to.
Agreed.
And that's what my point has been all along.
But also an endorsement of part of it is an endorsement of all of it. So just because let's say you use U.S. currency, and therefore you return a portion of that U.S. currency at the government's request, that doesn't mean that you endorse everything else that the government does
Right,
or stands for
right,
either. It's
right.
it's piecemeal.
It's nuance. There's a nuance to this. You can be nuanced.
Yeah, it's like, for instance, you could be completely moneyless other than, let's say you only had $5 and you didn't use money otherwise. So you don't have to pay any taxes. You don't have to render anything to Caesar that doesn't belong to him, and you don't really have anything that belongs to him but this $5. But let's say you use a road that belongs to the United States government and it has a toll. Okay, I'm not saying that you should buck the toll, and then like drive around it and then have a high speed chase with the police. I'm not suggesting that.
Unless you're like my wife, who says, go the other way instead
the other
of
way.
that's
Well,
on the
I mean,
interstate,
there is
you know?
prudence.
Yeah.
There is prudence. But what I am saying is that no, what the New Testament passages, right? Romans 13, we're talking about this example from the Gospels. They don't contradict 1 Samuel chapter 8. They are in harmony. We
Right.
can
I
say
agree with that.
in one sense that we can acknowledge that God works through non-Christian governments to still restrain evil. He still works, and then if we're under a non-Christian government, we're still to seek the benefit of the city, like it says in Jeremiah, right? When the people go into captivity, they're told like, hey, work for the benefit of that city, right? Referring to Babylon, really. So we're still to work to the benefit of the place that we're in,
Well, let me ask you this question.
and you still have to pay taxes.
Would you say that we as Christians, we have the freedom to pick and choose how we will participate in the system, so long as we don't violate laws? So long as we don't. I mean, the thing is that okay, you have to pay Social Security, okay, because they withhold it from your paycheck. Okay, you can go ahead and collect your Social Security when you get to be in a later age. But there's other things that they're asking you to participate in that you can say no to, that you say no and you don't participate.
And some of it we could probably say you should. At this point, with the state of our government being the way it is, to the kind of state it's progressed into, I mean, at this point, Christians need to be looking to withdraw their participation from the system in as much as human possible.
right.
So if you can avoid paying taxes, like our eminent president has exemplified by only paying $750 apparently.
That's a lie.
If you can follow that example and avoid paying as much taxes as humanly possible, okay, without committing outright fraud. So if you can avoid paying taxes through legitimate means that aren't going to endanger you and your family, you should pursue them.
Pursue it, right.
And I would say that regarding a lot of the things that we do, regulations, you name it, there's a lot of regulations that are oppressive to the poor. You could even argue that about child labor laws. Child labor laws are one of the most harmful things to families that exist.
Yeah.
If your kid can go over and rake leaves and make money when your family needs some money for food, it shouldn't be against the law to do that. And there's all sorts of examples that we can use that I would say Christians, if they can find ways around some of those laws, they absolutely should find ways around them because they're unjust laws.
Yeah, but that's not. But saying that you can do something in a state that is oppressive does not excuse the oppressiveness of that.
No,
state.
it does not. No, the oppressiveness of the
No.
state. No, I'm not excusing the oppressiveness of the state. But the thing is, the only way that Christians are going to wake up regarding the United States or any Western government that they find themselves oppressed by currently is by realizing that the system of governments that we have were not unique and special and uniquely
right.
Christian.
That's
and that's
exactly
the
right.
mistake that they
Yeah,
made.
that's
Christians like to view the United States as a city on a hill. They want to attach Christian language to a system that was explicitly a resurrection, a renaissance of pagan ideas. Democracy and republics, right? We always use those terms a lot in reference to the United States, that we're a democratic society, we're a republican society. Democracies and republics are pagan ideas. They came from pagan philosophers. They have no origination or analog in scripture whatsoever. And so we should stop idolizing them as though they were some good, superior, unique, or even Christian ideas, because they're not.
Going back to what God said in Samuel, every government is going to be taking advantage of you.
Yes.
I mean, there's
Yes.
not a single one that's ever existed
No.
that is not going to take
Yes.
advantage.
And at the end of the day, what I'm pointing out is, and I want to go through my outline here real quick on this just to kind of really lay it out, okay? Because now I think we've established the areas that we were kind of fuzzy on. The difference between how God works through individual covenants. Covenants are with every individual. So when we talk about the covenant, people's covenant relationship with God in the church, let's talk about our church.
So let me make sure
ahead.
that we're on the same page. Social contract, then, you're saying, and I'm willing to accede this, I'm just saying.
Sure.
Social contract is not a covenant.
No.
Okay.
not in the way that God works through
All right.
individuals.
Okay.
Because a social contract,
Defining or-
yes, and
Wow,
remember,
I'm
these
gl-
are pagan ideas. So
I'm glad we
social-
spent all that time just saying that social contract.
Well, no, this
not
is
a
important.
covenant.
This is important.
This is important,
like-
John
This is
Michael.
important. Okay, so when I say a social contract versus individual covenant, I'm contrasting both terms.
Well, of
Contract
course,
and
yeah.
covenant, individual and social.
Yeah.
So the idea that that we
Yeah.
are, remember the 3 pillars of paganism,
Wait
right?
a second, John Michael. Contract by its very nature is covenant. So please.
Yes, but this is the
But
reason
anyway,
why the distinction is made, because a social contract is not a covenant.
Yeah, but a social contract isn't even a contract.
Yeah.
Well, no, that's the irony of it, though. His point
not
out,
even a contract.
hey, this was part of the confusion, though.
Contract is made between individuals.
It's
This is
It's
the
not
point.
made socially.
This was Pastor's
contract
point.
is a covenant.
Pastor's point is that contracts typically are equivalent with the term covenant
Correct.
in the historic language.
Correct.
But that's the irony in the term social
Please
contract.
quit trying to change English.
Yeah, yeah.
you know,
So
I mean,
yes, but the point is though is that the social contract is not a covenant because,
okay.
and that's what's misleading about the phrase.
that's what we're proceeding on
Yes,
that basis.
because what makes a social contract considered a contract is this idea of implied consent, which is
Oh,
a
my.
contradiction. There's no such thing as implied consent. There's either you consent or you don't consent. Implied consent is a trick that they use to justify the social contract's authority. Because basically, right now, if let's say there's an election and they vote in Kamala Harris, right, or Joe Biden and he dies and Kamala Harris comes in, and Kamala Harris says that okay, and Congress supports her, and they say that every woman can only have one child, all other children are to be aborted, and that you cannot have guns. And let's say they implement these things, right? According to social contract theory, if the majority of the people voted for that, right, and this is the will of the people, then that's legitimate. Its legitimacy comes from the social contract, from the will of the people. It doesn't matter if a minority disagrees or not, because a minority must submit to the social contract. Social contract is not unanimous. See, where a covenant is, see, a covenant, every single member of a church has agreed to the covenant. So actually there is no, it's not a democracy. Okay, the way a covenant, the God's covenants work, it's not a democracy. You don't get a vote, and the church doesn't get a vote as far as like what the covenant stipulates. God stipulates the covenant by his word, and every single individual who's a member of the covenant has agreed to it in its totality. So it's actually a form of what's called voluntarism. That is, the entire system of the church is 100% voluntary because everybody in the church has pre-agreed to the terms. When a Christian, let's say someone who's a member of the church, commits a grievous sin and doesn't repent and is thrown out of the church, right? They're thrown out of the church because they have violated something that they agreed to was a sin. They agreed, let's use an example, let's say adultery or something. Right. Okay? A member of the church commits adultery or is in an adulterous affair and refuses to repent and put away the person that they're with. Okay? They've already agreed to the covenant law when they became a Christian and became a member of that church that was immoral, that adultery was wrong because God says so. They already pre-agreed to that law. And so when they violate and refuse to repent of it, when the church throws them out or excommunicates them or bars them from the table because of their refusal to repent, they are actually being thrown out, not because they violated a law that they didn't agree to. They're being thrown out because they've actually violated their covenant contract. Their covenant contract with God through the church is that they have agreed to these terms and that they have submitted to the authority of the church through the keys of the kingdom, and that when they refuse to repent or acknowledge sin when it's been biblically brought to them, this is the punishment that they've agreed to beforehand. Social contract doesn't work that way, because even if you disagree with a law, and let's say you're a minority individual and the majority holds to a certain law that's an immoral law, it doesn't matter whether you agree or disagree. If you're a minority member and you're in that nation, implied consent, you must submit to it morally speaking, because your will is always subjugated to the whole. That's very different than how God works us with covenant, because the covenant made is with each individual specifically. He made a covenant with Ken Zitch when you took your first communion. He made a covenant with, you know what I mean?
Yes.
And actually he made the covenant at baptism, but it's, he made a covenant with Ken Zitch at his baptism, but it's reaffirmed at your confirmation, at your communion. And that's the whole difference between a social contract.
Well, are you going to get to I suppose then in your outline you're going to get to what a Christian's responsibility is.
Yeah, I am going to get to that.
Okay.
But the thing is that the social contract idea was really championed by John Locke and Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Jean-Jacques Rousseau championed it in France in the French Revolution, and John Locke championed it in England, which became the basis for the United States Constitution. In fact, several...
Does that have to do with the Magna Carta and stuff like that?
Well, no, Magna Carta
Whoa, whoa, whoa,
was
whoa.
no.
Oh my gosh.
The Magna Carta was actually of a covenantal nature, and it was signed by every member.
No, I mean, was this around the time?
No,
of
Magna
the
Carta. No, that was the Mayflower Compact. Sorry.
Okay, I can't remember 61, if you don't mind.
Yeah. So anyway,
the thing
Magna
is,
Carta.
did when John Locke lived around the time of the revolutionaries?
Okay, so Magna Carta would have been, I think, 13th
I think we
century.
need to make things clear for
Yeah,
people that are listening.
So 13th or 12th century was the Magna Carta, and that was a restraint on the king by the nobility in England, which actually is
But
because
John Locke lived.
No, it was later. It was after.
No.
He was the son of a parliamentary officer in the English Civil War, so he would have been
1800s.
no
1700s.
no. So yeah, I mean, getting there, 1600s, because he's writing
maybe I
before
think of
he's writing
Rousseau.
before Berkeley, and Berkeley is writing in the late 1600s.
Well, Rousseau was more like 1800s.
Yeah, he's later than
Yeah,
Locke.
yeah.
Locke, okay, so you have Jean-Jacques Rousseau and Locke. But anyway, so John Locke's ideas, he actually penned a constitutional document that became the Constitution of the colony of North Carolina. So that shows you how influential Locke was on systems of government in the United States. Now, Locke was one really propagating republic. Now, he agreed with Hobbes on the idea of a social contract. Remember, we discussed Hobbes earlier. So Hobbes said it's the will of the people to institute a form of government. They institute monarchy. Locke disagreed with Hobbes. He says, yes, people institute their own form of government, but the ideal form of government that any people could institute would be a republic. Okay, so that was that was what he was championing.
Time out.
Go ahead.
Quickly. Can we say that perhaps he was right, but he was right in that if you just look at it from a technical sense, a republic is the best form of government.
No, I would say-
however, it was like we can also say though that like every other form of government, human government, it was destined to fail because
I
of
would agree
human
with
nature.
that. I would agree with that.
Okay.
Monarchy and republic are both human forms of government, and they're doomed to fail. But I would say monarchy is actually superior to republic. and I
Okay,
have
you
many
would say
reasons.
okay.
Yeah, because the government is still privately owned. So what's interesting about monarchy is that it, unlike some of the other forms of social contract government, it can also be kind of adapted to a covenantal structure. It's obvious that a king like the nations, that monarchy is still a human system, but it's the only system that God used, the only structure that God has used for his covenantal purposes. Like, for
Okay,
instance,
because you're talking from in terms of an Old Testament.
yes, King David.
perspective,
Yeah.
King David and
Correct.
Solomon.
So it was still a
Okay.
pagan idea, but God used it as a type to foreshadow the coming of Christ, the true king. And it was used by God in a good way, though once again, the monarchy became corrupt and tyrannical even there. So, but the point is that what makes monarchy different and superior to democracies or republics is that because it's privately owned, its powers of expense are restrained. Okay, so the thing is with a monarchy's never had the level of laws or debts or anything comparable to what modern democracies and republics were able to accumulate. And the reason that is because a monarch privately owned the government. So what that means is that the king was personally and financially liable for whatever the government did. So for instance, if the king raised an army, even though he could raise taxes to help levy some funds for it, generally speaking, it was out of his personal treasury, the king's treasury, that the funds were levied for the state, and he couldn't charge too much taxes because the nobility would usually rise up and decapitate him. So the monarch was restrained in his expenses because he was privately responsible. Whereas in a republic, a representative who serves only for a short number of years, like a term, he can come in and he can raise the debt ceiling, for instance, and then go back home, and he has not suffered any personal loss. But if a monarch were to raise the debt, his own estate, his own investments would actually be levied against that expense. So he could lose things financially, whereas a
He could also
representative...
lose the support of his nobles.
Well, correct. But see, with representative government, it doesn't work that way because you can go in and vote to $100 trillion, and you're not going to lose your car.
Yeah.
Because now the government's publicly owned. And this is the poison, though, with Republican and Democratic systems and why they're the worst. And why when Locke resurrected him, he actually resurrected an idea so sinister, his monarchy would have been much preferable to what we had when you look at the levels of taxation. Monarchs rarely taxed to extremely high levels, and you only have a few examples. Even with Louis XIV, he never would have dreamed to try to outlaw alcohol, and we think of him as an oppressive government that instigated the French Revolution. But just like in that example, what always comes later is worse. The nobles rose up and killed the king of Rome, because Rome actually had a king. It had a monarchy before it had a republic. And it was the nobility that killed the monarch and established a republic. Not too much unlike how it happened in the French Revolution.
Well, that's the thing. Republics and democracies are pagan forms of government.
That's the point.
And
yeah.
and never ever have we ever seen a republic or a democracy that's lasted very long. They always move towards monarchies.
Yeah, well, statism, a centralized state. Because in fascism and in National Socialism, the difference between them and a democracy, because once again, Hitler and Mussolini would actually argue that their systems are social contract as well. See, Hitler actually believed he was the embodiment of the will of the people, the will of the German people, the German Volk. And Mussolini believed the same thing, because for their systems, they believed that they were the full evolution of democracy in a republic, where in a democracy or republic, you vote for your representative. In fascism or National Socialism, the head, the Führer or the Duce, they are the embodiment of the will of the people, no vote required.
Right.
Now, for Stalin, it's the same thing, the will of the proletariat, the tyranny of the proletariat, of the working class. Stalin was the embodiment of that will to keep the nation in trust until the people were able to govern themselves, which is, of course, a pipe dream.
Yeah, but what do you have to say, though, about the fact that none of those systems were as they say they were?
Well, of course.
For instance, Stalin never really represented the proletariat.
No, I agree.
And Hitler never really represented
agree.
the middle class. And Duce
Yes.
never really.
No, and a constitutional republic in the United States never protected our rights.
Okay, I'm good with that.
Yeah, and so what I would say is that none of these things can keep these dreams, because at the end of the day, they're unable to restrain the human lust for power, because they don't require 100% voluntary consent like the church does when it comes to the covenant. What happens in the nation state is, because it's the will of the majority, typically is what happens, the government will expand. Like in the United States, you could only vote if you were a land-owning male, right? You had to have at least 44 acres, I think it was, in most states. You had to be a man, a white man typically, and a Christian. Now, what ended up happening was it all started to peel away. So you didn't have to be a Christian anymore. Pretty soon you didn't have to be a landowner. Then you didn't have to be a male. Then you don't even have to be a normal human being. Now you can be transgender. You can be anything. So it expands the voter base as much as humanly possible in order to expand the amount of public wealth it can accumulate. So in order for a state to continue to expand its power, it has to constantly be increasing how many people are in its government.
Legal immigrants.
Yes. So not only by expanding the voter base, but also by developing more and more bureaucracy. That's another thing the United States government did. It created so many more offices and unelected positions of authority, and this is what all governments do. And the reason that they do it is because the principle of public ownership doesn't have any limitations. You see, when the king privately owned the government, he was limited by his own holdings. But when you publicly own something, now it belongs to everybody, which means it really belongs to no one.
Well, let's
Go ahead.
Before you go on, let's make sure everybody understands that all of this started, all of this came about as a result of a social contract that was made. I mean, you see governments corrupting themselves, expanding their voter base, and so on and so forth. And what we're saying here, and I think we all agree on this, is that it's inevitable.
Yeah, it is inevitable.
It's inevitable. It's going to happen. You know, for the United States, it took 200 and something years.
Yes.
You know, the thing is that you can watch Little House on the Prairie and all that sort of thing, and you can think, well, everything was just great back then, and perhaps it was a lot better than what it was.
Yeah, but the
today.
seeds were there.
But the seeds were there.
Yes.
You know, and you see these seeds germinating in the United States. Probably, they really started germinating during the Civil War. I mean, maybe before
sure.
that, but even in the Constitution and in the Declaration of Independence. You know, you had the seeds being planted in that they didn't deal with the issues that they needed to deal with at that
Correct.
point in time, particularly slavery and stuff like that. But as time went on, you began to see these things become more and more and more.
Yeah, and that's the thing is, and that's why all Western governments have basically gone to the same point. Democracy will lead to communism eventually. Democracy is just the young.
And that's an important point.
Yeah.
Say that again.
Yeah, democracy will lead to communism
Democracy will
eventually.
lead to communism.
Yeah, because the
Exactly.
principle of public ownership will expand.
Right.
You see, the United States government argued, let's say, everything was to be privately owned, right? Free market capitalism.
Right.
The United States Constitution acknowledged that everything is to be privately owned except the government. You see, and that's the difference between monarchy and what the United States did. You see, people like to talk about the United States as being the champion of free market capitalism over and against monarchy. That's a typical picture of the American Revolution. But in reality, monarchy claims that everything is privately owned, including the government. The monarch privately owns the state. But the United States argued that everything should be privately owned except the government. The government is owned by the people of the United States. But see, that was the first big mistake.
Problem.
That's the first big mistake. Because what that did is it allowed
Yeah.
more and more things to become publicly owned through the expansion of the voter
Yes,
base and the ownership of things by the state.
Yep.
And pretty soon, everything is owned by the public, and that's called communism.
That's called
when
communism.
the public owns
Socialism,
everything.
communism,
Correct.
whatever.
It's
yeah.
inevitable.
Well, socialism is just the political agenda for communism.
Yes, if you vote, and at the end of the day, it's the same thing. If you give people the vote to choose what they want, they will always vote to pay less and get more.
They want to take money out of the till.
You know, what's funny is in the 60s and 70s,
Might have
our
had-
country was fighting against communism and seeking to uproot it wherever it sought to lay its hold. And now we have people, representatives in parties that call themselves socialists unapologetically. You know, they call themselves socialists, democratic socialists, but still socialists, and they're being supported by citizens of the United States and being put forth as candidates to vote for.
Exactly.
So in a matter of 30 years.
But can we agree on what you're saying there? Can we agree on the fact that, okay, these people are out there calling themselves socialists, okay? We're not a socialist country. Technically, these people should be
Well,
aside,
we
constrained.
are.
They should be put in
wait a
jail.
minute, though.
You know, for what they're
We are socialists in a lot of ways.
Huh?
We're socialists in a lot of ways. What I'm talking about is look at how quickly the tide has turned. Okay, in that we've gone from, well, it's not even like we weren't socialists in the 60s and 70s. We were. The principles were there. Our government we're more socialist today, but our government was socialist.
Our government started moving towards socialism with the institution of the Federal Reserve and with FDR. That's
FDR, yeah,
those
exactly.
Those two things
exactly.
working.
Yeah, the
in-
welfare
So
state.
like
the welfare
this
state,
whole
yeah.
idea that older people like you, this whole idea
Wait,
that older
wait
people
a
like you
minute.
looking back to times when they grew up and whatever, saying, "Oh, times are so nice," and they
I
have
see
this
a gray hair in
picturesque.
your- I see a gray hair. In
They have this picturesque Christian understanding of America. Technically, that's a fraud. That's a fraudulent conception because America hasn't been Christian for a while.
Yeah. Now I want to make a caveat there. Okay, and the caveat I will say is that with the increase in statism, the less moral and traditional the society will become.
because the people, the thing is that our republic was set up in such a way so as to keep the mob from being in control, more or less. With the electoral college
I
and
don't
stuff
buy
like that. Well, it might not have worked out that way, John Michael, but that's the way it was set up. You can't deny that. But it was set up so that the mob wouldn't take control of your personal life. It wouldn't take control. But the thing is that what's happened over time is that the mob has encroached more and more and more.
Yeah,
on your
and I would say the
personal liberty.
structures of the United States government allowed this to happen. That eventually it would.
Yeah.
Now, one of the things I was going to talk about is that with the social contract and with the state, as the state expands, the population becomes more degenerate.
Yes.
The kings of the nation
That's
do
my
lead
point.
people astray, kind of like in the case of Jezebel.
Yeah.
But like the way it does it though. Is insidious and there's a system of logic called praxeology, which studies human action, and it works from certain axioms. But one of the things that's important about it that it teaches, and this is basic economics, and there's a lot of confusion out there. People think that, okay, well, if you have libertarian principles, that means you're libertine. Libertine as in that you just you're good with anything that goes on. People can be homos over there banging, and there could be people can be over there snorting heroin. Like, people can do all these different things, and we're just free to whatever. But in reality, in a state where there is no centralized social contract state government, okay, people tend to actually not be as immoral because the state actually incentivizes immoral behavior, usually intentionally. But I'll give you an example. Let me give you an example. So if you had no government, okay, there was none, okay, and what I mean by government here is, I mean no social contract state. Let's say it's you have a church community maybe, and the church governs, but other than that, there's no state. You rule your own life on your own private property. Now, in this state of nature, so to speak, where you don't have this government with all these different policies and taxes, typically it doesn't make sense, for instance, for a woman to be single. Okay, it would be a dangerous situation for her because you have no police, you have no military, you have none of that stuff. So a woman usually won't be working and doing things on her own apart from a husband, because being the weaker sex, she needs leadership, she needs headship, she needs to have protection in this state because other men who are big and strong will come and they could take advantage of her. These natural patriarchal structures thrive in the situation where you have no centralized government. The reason societies become more egalitarian, the more statist they become, is intentional, because the husband figure is replaced by the state. Now, it started with welfare, which was easy how you could see how they did that.
Yeah.
They incentivized single motherhood because they actually
Absolutely.
gave money if
Yep.
you were a single mother.
Right.
Now they say, well, single mothers need money. But the thing is, whatever you throw money at, you're going to get more of. So if you give money to homeless people, for instance, as a welfare, they say, well, you're homeless, so we're going to give you money. Okay, what you're going to end up having is more homelessness. Because people are like, well, I can get money for being homeless, so I'll just be homeless. Just like with single motherhood. They knew, in the black community, for instance, they had a better rate of marriage than white people did prior to Johnson's war on poverty. And the reason it reversed, and now 80% of black men don't grow up in households with fathers, is because when you incentivize single motherhood by giving it a welfare check, the black community is like, okay, well, I guess we just won't get married then. And there shouldn't be anything bad that comes from that, right? Well, you have a decadent, immoral populace that goes right along with the statist agenda, as you've seen with Black Lives Matter. You created a people that they have no God, they have no father, they have no other institution except the state to turn to.
Well, the
And when
state is their family.
It
The state
is.
is their father.
Correct, because it provides everything they need. But that's just one example. I mean, with the feminist movement too, there could be no feminist movement if it wasn't for men basically go along with the state policies and helping to get them in place. In a state of nature, there is no feminism, because what's a woman going to do? If there is no government and basically men are like, hey, you can't come here, there's nothing that a woman can do about it. That's just the way it is.
There's no abortion either.
No, if men want to stop them, they can. Well, and there's a lot of things. There's homosexuality is almost non-existent in it when there's no major government, because thing is, even with homosexuality, and the reason that typically emerges when governments are super bloated and big and when they're about to collapse, and that's why some historians have called them the vultures of civilization, because they appear en masse when a society is about to collapse. The main reason is because homosexuality is not a natural lifestyle. So in a situation where you didn't have a large government, most people wouldn't turn to that, because you wouldn't have any way of passing on land to children, because you produce no children. So you can't keep anything in trust. You cannot guarantee provision in your old age because you have no offspring. So homosexuality is not turned to in a state of nature. But the state allows it because you have welfare, because you have death taxes, because you have all these systems. Homosexuality is allowed to flourish because you no longer need to have children in order to guarantee the preservation of your property and your care in old age. That's why. Yes, that's why Social Security is also destructive, because historically old people were cared for by their children in old age, like the Bible teaches, and instead we turned it over to the government through Social Security and Social Security taxes. But this is the point. As governments expand, they destroy those institutions that don't need them, which is the church and the family. The church and the family are all you really need. And that's what God is talking about when he says that it's not you they have forsaken me. And that's what he says to Samuel. Why does he say that to Samuel? Because the church operating amongst families ruling over their own land is the system that was established by God. And having a king like a nation leads to tyranny and eventually leads to the apostasy and immorality of the people.
This all goes back to Genesis, where it says, be fruitful and multiply and take dominion over the land. And the thing is that what he's talking about there is godly people. We're talking about godly families. We're talking about godly individuals. Be fruitful and multiply. Raise up your children in the way that they should go, so when they're older, they will not depart from
Yes.
it. And as you're going, you will take in this sense, you will take dominion over the land.
I agree.
Yeah, and that's what we're talking about. And if you're not raising up godly families, and you're not taking dominion over the land, and that's what's happened with the United States. The United States is collapsing because the Christians that live in the United States haven't taken dominion over the land.
Yeah, and I agree. And when we're talking about Christians increasingly stopping their participation in a state that is increasingly illegitimate in its functions, an alternative, Christians can do it. You see, Christians have forgotten what it's like to govern themselves because we've become so accustomed to these unnatural conditions which the state has created. But the system where husbands are head of their families and they take care of the protection and provision, you don't need a police and a military to protect your family. You need a gun, or you need a knife or a sword. God has provided us with the means. And capital punishment, you don't need a government to do capital punishment. If the church determines that something is immoral and is punishable with capital crimes, let's say murder or adultery or homosexuality, we can go down the line. Okay, what God has determined to be punishable. Well, guess who was given the power to punish? It was actually the elders over the people of Israel.
family.
Yes. So, for instance, when Judah was suspicious that Tamar had gone a whoring, okay, Judah was going to put her to death. Judah had the authority to do that, and the reason Judah had authority to do that is that he was head of his clan, of his people, and he was in control of the lands, and Tamar was under his authority. And they were all members of the same covenant. Okay, so they had pre-agreed that this certain act was criminal, and that if you do this certain act, it would have been punishable by death. Of course, it turned out that Judah was actually the one who had impregnated Tamar, and so I'm sure he had a change of heart right towards the end there.
So this is what you're talking about when you're differentiating between social contract and covenant.
I'm contracting between God's system of government
Okay.
and the system of the nations.
All right, gotcha.
And I would say that monarchy's kind of in between, and monarchy's superior to other systems that pagans develop, but overall all of them lead to the same thing eventually, which is that this is important too, to go back, that this is not a new idea. I brought this up earlier, how it was a pagan idea and it emerged in Rome. You can go to Plato, you can go to Socrates, you can go to Cicero. They're all advocating for a social contract. And when you go back to the church fathers, though, who are interacting with these ancient authors, the church fathers were critical of the idea of a social contract. Lactantius and St. Augustine are two principal ones I want to bring to mind. Yeah. Now, Lactantius was committed by Constantine to write a systematic theology, or would have been the equivalent of a systematic theology in the patristic period. So Lactantius was considered orthodox by other Christians at the time, but Lactantius in his work is addressing the idea of a social contract. In fact, the way he describes it is certain pagans believed that man dwelled in caves with other animals. He actually describes this. Right? And what's this sound like? Okay.
Evolution.
Yeah. And he says that they had to come together in order to protect themselves from other people and from animals, and they formed societies and kings from that. Now, that's exactly what Hobbes argued in the Enlightenment, and what Locke argued in the Enlightenment, and what Rousseau argued in the Enlightenment, was basically that man was another animal, and that the tribe, the group of people, came together and instituted government. It's the right of the people to institute their own form of government. So this idea is a pagan idea. It comes from the belief that man is a social animal, not an individual made in the image of God. That's why individual covenant in this conversation is contrasted with social contract, because social contract assumes that man is a social animal, and that in principle, the way the pagans developed, the two ideas were inseparable. The reason you have a social contract is because man is a social animal and is part of a tribe, and his individual will is always submitted to the will of the tribe and what the tribe needs.
Is that not summed up in the statement, the sum of the parts are greater than the whole?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, yeah, that would definitely, well, no, it would be, yeah, the sum of the parts is greater than any one of the parts, I guess, would probably be another way of saying it. But
I got to bring this up. This is kind of the same thing, but it's kind of, I've always been struck by Captain Kirk and Mr. Spock's dialogue at the end of the Wrath of Khan, when he says, the needs of the many outweigh the
yeah.
needs of the few or the one.
Or the
You
one.
know? That's a socialistic thing,
Yeah.
isn't it?
It
Yes.
is. Well, the
Yes.
creators of Star Trek were
Yes,
anti-Christian.
very similar.
The creators of Star Trek were
Whenever we're
anti-Christian.
talking about this,
Yeah.
believe it or not, this always comes back to my mind.
Yeah.
The needs of the many
Sure.
outweigh the needs of the one.
Yeah,
Yeah.
the authors of Star Trek wanted to
Yeah.
create an intentionally non-Christian future that was secular. They intentionally did that to
But isn't
create
it interesting that,
what they envisioned.
that Captain Kirk comes out and he says, in the next episode, he says, the need of the one
Outweighs needs of many.
Needs of the many.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I love that.
Yeah, that is. Well, I mean, yeah, that's because what makes up the many, but individual ones.
Yeah. Right.
Yes. And I think the message to Christians would be now is like we were talking about separating ourselves and that we can govern ourselves through godly covenants rather than trying to submit to the social contract, which is not even really legitimate anyway, and comes from that same pagan worldview where you have the sacrifice of offspring and you have the dehumanization of man through the worship of nature. All of these elements kind of work together because first you take God off his throne by saying that the things that he created are the ones that fill the role of what Christians would say is the role of the creator. You know, sun, heat, light, food, everything that we have comes from the natural world. That's what scientism brought in. And then from there, what that means is that because God is not the creator nor the sustainer of reality, that means man is not made in the image of God. Rather, man is just another animal. And because man is another animal, then his form of government comes from the will of the tribe because he is just a social animal, one among many. The whole thing works together. It's an unholy trinity. Whereas in reality, we would argue, contrast to that God is a personal God who is the one who by his word not only created all things, but sustains all things. In contrast to that, we would say that, no, we are not to sacrifice our children, but in reality, the children are the means by which we take dominion of the earth. They are the heritage of the Lord, and it is through them that God grows his church primarily. And then thirdly, unlike them, we don't say that man is a social animal whose individual will is subject to the many. Rather, we say, no, we are an individual made in the image of God, and God personally covenants with us as individuals. And all the laws and all the money that we give, everything that we have is something that we agree to through God's word.
Before you go on, let's make sure that that's got to be, the thing is that we have this tendency, people, evangelicals, Christians have gone along with this interpretation of Romans 13.
Yes.
Okay.
We talked about this last time a little bit too.
Yeah, where people think that just because the government says something,
Yes.
that we have to obey it because the government was ordained by God.
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly.
Now, but that isn't true.
Correct.
That isn't true. The thing is that the government is given by God to enforce the laws. And
Yes.
primarily,
Yeah, and to
the
restrain
government-
evil for our
to
good.
restrain evil for our good. It's really what we're talking about here is the first table.
Yeah.
You know, we're talking about the commandments. We're talking about the government is set up to make sure that the commandments are.
Yes. And even kings like the nations, once again, we contrast God's rule versus man's rule. Even through man's rule, God uses it for his purpose. Like, for instance, King David, he was part of a monarchical system that the people of Israel in rebellion demanded, right? They demanded to have a king like the nations. So what makes King David different? Well, because God even uses the evil things that man tries to bring about against him. God's more clever than us, right? So what Joseph's brothers, they thought they were pretty clever by throwing him and, selling him into slavery. And God says, and what does Joseph say to his brothers in the end? He
What
goes,
you intended for evil,
God meant it for good, right?
Well,
So,
'cause-
and what did people of Israel, what they intended by wanting a king like the nations, they meant it for evil, but God meant it for good because through that same monarchy, he brought about the line of Christ.
Because King David was chosen by God.
Correct. And same thing with Romans 13. Like the Caesars and the way that the nations are. These are pagan systems. The Roman system was a pagan system, but it was through that pagan system that we had the Council of Nicaea.
Before you go on, can we say
And our
that
creed.
any system that is set up by a social contract is a pagan system?
Absolutely. 100%.
Yes, correct.
100%.
It's important to make
Correct.
that.
Yes.
Any social contract conception of government
Correct.
is a pagan
Yeah.
system.
Yes. And that
Yeah.
includes every system of government in the world
Yeah.
today.
Yeah.
Is a social contract system. And the only remnant of the voluntary covenant system, the system wherein individuals are in covenant with God, the only system that remains is the church.
So what you're saying then basically is going back to the beginning of our conversation that a covenant relationship is really only a relationship that can be had with God.
Well, you can have covenants in, like, for instance, the covenant
No,
of
you
marriage.
can have a covenant between individuals.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like,
Okay.
yeah, like a
Okay.
true, like
Okay.
what a
Like
contract is
I
supposed
make
to
a covenant
be.
with you that you live on my land and you can use my land, okay? And this is reference to medieval times, right? I own this land. I own all like 100 acres of land. I make a covenant with you that I'm going to give you 10 of those acres and you can live on those acres and you can farm them. You can use them for whatever you need to sustain yourself, to provide for yourself. And in return, you covenant that you are going, if I need to raise an army, if I'm getting attacked, then you're going to, you're going to
Okay,
come
so that's the
and
case.
you're going
Fight
to
with
come fight for my case.
What you're saying then is, and
My
let me make
side.
sure that this is straight
Uh-huh.
with regards to the two of you. A covenant is an agreement that can only be made under the auspices of the Almighty.
Yeah. Well, here's what I would say. A
When we
covenant.
say
no,
that,
no.
I'm
A
wondering.
covenant is where two parties explicitly consent.
But they consent because it has to be fulfilled. I mean, in one sense or another, if I covenant with you,
There's human covenants. There's human covenants
well,
and there's divine
human
covenants.
covenant is a contract, is an agreement,
Yeah,
or something
sure,
like that.
sure.
But a covenant is something that only God, that can only be established under the auspices of God.
Yeah, a divine
And
covenant
it's
is that
something
way.
that
Yes.
both sides have to fulfill
Yes.
in the way that it's
Yes.
set out to be fulfilled.
Yes.
Can we say that?
Yeah, I can say that. Okay, and I'm
I'm
saying
not
that.
sure what you're saying.
Well, no, he's
but
basically
it's-
saying regarding a divine covenant, like the covenant
Okay.
with the church, right? It's something that is under the authority and auspices of God and His Word, but both parties explicitly consent. Okay.
okay.
And it has to be fulfilled in the way that it's set out to be fulfilled.
Yeah, of course.
Okay, that's a covenant.
What does that mean?
That means the
That means
stipulations
you
of
have
the
to keep
covenant.
you have to keep your end of the deal.
Yeah.
You know, I
Okay.
mean, you have to
All
keep
right.
your end of the
Yeah.
deal.
And
All
as
right.
monergists, and see the
Okay.
difference. So people say, well, when I hear this term voluntary and agree, and you agree to the covenant, that sounds very Arminian or Pelagian or synergist. And I want to reiterate this so there's no confusion with anybody who would be listening.
Oh, for God's sake,
When
no.
I,
Sounds like you have to choose.
No, there's
sounds
no
like you
choice.
have to
But
choose
that's
to
not
be
what we're
part of
saying.
it.
When we
Yeah.
say that someone agrees to the covenant, that's like for saying that someone has faith. Just because you have faith doesn't mean that the faith originates in you or is by your own power.
course.
Faith is just a condition, okay? It's a condition that God meets through His work. So God is the one who helps you fulfill your end because you can't fulfill your end.
But you
'Cause
still have to have
both,
faith.
you were talking about the covenant being fulfilled, right? Both parties have
Both
to
parties-
fulfill their obligations,
Yes.
right? The thing is, what true Christianity teaches, what monergism teaches versus synergism. See, both of them would probably agree this idea that God's system is covenantal and both parties explicitly consent. The Arminian or the Pelagian is not disagreeing with the Lutheran or the Reformed on this part of it. The difference is that the Lutheran admits, along with usually the Reformed would probably agree with us on this, is that yes, both parties have to fulfill their end of the bargain regarding the covenant. But what Lutherans confess is that because we are sinful, we can't. And so God is the one who helps us to fulfill it because we can't do it of ourselves.
But even in
In
saying
fact, in
that
some cases, He
even in-
satisfies it Himself.
Even in saying
Correct.
that we can't fulfill covenants, that means that doesn't take away our responsibility.
Correct.
No.
Exactly.
Doesn't make our
That's all I was
responsibility
bringing
to
up.
Because covenant is
Yeah.
a divine thing.
Yeah.
Can we say that?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Divine. It's a divine thing.
Yeah.
I would
and
say-
even
I would-
human
Covenant
covenants,
is something
yes.
that you have to fulfill. If you're entering into a covenant, this is something that God demands that you fulfill.
Well, even in earthly covenants, we're supposed
because
to keep our
God
yeas be
says,
yeas
"Let
and our
your
nays
word,
be nays."
let your yes be yes,
Yes.
and let your no be no."
Yes. Correct.
So when you're entering into a covenant,
Correct.
you're saying yes or no.
Correct.
And you have
Yeah.
to fulfill the yes or the
But
no.
the church is different from the covenant made in the church is different, or covenant made with the church is different from other institutions because the church is a divine institution. So when you make a covenant with the church, you're making a covenant with God.
Yeah.
When I make a covenant with you, I'm
But
not
even if
making
you
a covenant
make
with God.
me,
I'm
even
not
if
making a
if
covenant
you're
with
making-
God.
If you're making a valid covenant, even if you're making a covenant with me, you have to fulfill that covenant because God is watching.
Yeah. So
Well,
like,
yeah, but
Right?
I'm not
Yes.
making a covenant with God.
No,
Expressly.
you can make a covenant with other people.
Yes.
But you have to fulfill a covenant you make with me because you're making it because
You're
God is
bound.
watching.
You're bound to the
Yeah.
terms of the
Bound
covenant.
to the terms
Yeah.
of that covenant.
Correct.
Okay.
Yes.
Correct.
Yep. There's no disagreement. And
Yeah.
so,
Yeah.
and that's what I'm contrasting with a social contract, because it's not really a covenant or a contract at all.
All right.
It's something that you're born into bondage to. It's an idea that originates in pagan philosophy, and it implies that the individual is not made in the image of God, but the individual will is subject to the will of the herd. And that's what differentiates
See,
a
I
social
did-
contract
I
and
didn't
an
know.
individual
And we
covenant.
still see
I
covenants.
didn't know that was the origin
Oh.
of social contract.
Yes.
Well, we still see covenants even in our
I
society.
didn't know that.
We still see covenants even in our society. Even our society hasn't gone so extreme, so extremely communist, so extremely socialist that we don't see any kind of covenants whatsoever. I mean, when you covenant, when you get a credit card, that's a covenant.
Yeah. I mean, we still
know.
live in a mixed system, but when communism were to absorb the whole system, there would be no longer any covenants at all, because it
Yeah.
would all fall under the auspice of the social contract. But like, I'll give marriage is a good example, because marriage is symbolic of the relationship that Christians have with Christ through the church, right? Because what's the analogy in Ephesians 5, right? The relationship between Christ and his
Husbands,
church
love
is
your
the
wives.
same as a husband and a wife. And that's a
Christ loved the
covenant
church.
relationship. When you enter into marriage with your wife, it's a covenantal relationship.
Excellent. What you're saying there is that marriage is an institution by God. It's a covenant relationship.
Yes. Under God, both parties consent.
Both
Agree.
parties. Excellent.
Yes.
Yeah.
So the relationship of the American. So here's to contrast the two in plain terms. Our relationship to the United States government is not the same kind of relationship that a Christian has to God, for the same reasons that a husband's relationship to his wife is not the same as a citizen is to the United States. Because in the case of a Christian's relationship to the church and a Christian's relationship to his wife, both of those are examples of a covenant relationship.
Can we say
Whereas
that
a
there's
citizen of the United
nothing-
States is not covenantal at all?
Can we say that there's nothing in, let's say, temporal or pagan or other humanly kind of situations that mirrors that of marriage? The covenant of marriage is something that has no parallel in pagan culture.
No, no, it doesn't have. In Christian, obviously, marriage predates, and the pagans practice marriage and things like that. But when they practice marriage, they're just practicing something that God has intended as an analog for the relationship between Christ and the church. It's
Right.
kind of like when it says, when Paul says, where there is no law, there is no transgression. But when the Gentiles do what the law requires, they become a law unto themselves and are thereby condemned by it. Similarly, when pagans practice marriage, all they're doing is condemning themselves under the fact that Christ has come and has promised to redeem his church. So even when two pagans living off in Bangladesh somewhere get married, by marrying, what they do is that by entering into that covenant of marriage, what they're basically saying is that Christ has come, and
Right.
and we've refused him, and their very marriages condemn them of the fact that they are not in Christ.
Right.
So, and this is kind of the point, is like, we need to cast off these pagan ideas, and we need to start thinking like Christians. And this kind of summarizes this is the conclusion of the 3-part series, right? Where we talked about the new paganism. And so in concluding, we need to start thinking like Christians and not like pagans. We need to go to Christian ideas of the world, of human nature, of the state, of the family, and any idea that does not come from the Word of God must be submitted to the Word of God.
That's what I was getting to. The thing is before we close here, we need to help people to understand what a Christian's responsibility is in a when you're talking about we've been talking about here a social contract.
Yeah.
What is a Christian's responsibility in a social contract? What is a Christian bound to do?
The first thing is to acknowledge what it is, that the systems that we live under are not originating in Christian ideas. They're non-Christian systems, and that as Christians we are to seek Christian systems, Christian ideas. So we have to change our understanding first, and then we live that out practically. So what does a Christian do in a world like we live in? Well, what's Augustine's solution? Augustine has a good example of this, right? We pursue, right, the city of God, okay? while we travel through this world, we are walking through, and we're walking through that earthly city, right? The city of man. Right. We are dwelling in this place, but we are pilgrims moving towards the city of God. Practically, what that means in the Christian life is that we're storing up treasures in heaven in preparation to be with Christ. Right. But also it means that on a day-to-day level, we are living in, not indifferent to the state per se, because we can seek the well-being of our country, we can run for office, we can try to do things to limit and restrict the state's power. The state is something, it's a consequence of sin, right? If it wasn't for sin, we wouldn't have governments. Absolutely. And because of that, it's a force of nature that is dangerous. So Christians can and should try to restrain and restrict government and guide it away from harming our fellow Christians as much as we can. But there's also times when we just need to stay out of the way. So that's kind of like the attitude we have towards any government or any civilization. Civilizations come and go, but the church and the word of God will endure forever. Right. And so we have to know that if America collapses, what of it? Well, we've seen many empires collapse. Christianity is the eternal city, because we are in God and we are in Christ. So we know that as Christians, this will pass away. So what are we going to do about that? If we know that the systems that we live under may pass away, Christians are to live as Christians. So we marry and we give in marriage. Right? We live in the church, we break bread with one another, we help the poor, we obey the law of God, we aid each other, and we try to live as if there is no government. Right. And in as much as we have to obey, we obey, and in as much as we avoid it, we avoid it. And if we could create a system independent of it, where we just have the church and in Christian men living over their own land, enforcing God's law. If we could have that system, we seek it. But if we can't, we do the best we can under the systems that we live under.
Basically, we're in a situation that very closely proximates the situation of the early church.
I agree.
And that's exactly what they did.
Yes.
And there's people that want to say, well, the early church is communism because they were all giving and sharing alike. But that's not what it was at all. What it was is voluntary giving, living in a communal way where we're not relying upon the government to provide for ourselves.
Yes.
We are relying on each other. We're living as a separate community. Mm-hmm. And at the same time, engaging the world that we're in.
Yes.
And I think, we still have the possibility of influencing the world that we're in, because we're not being persecuted.
Yes. I mean, we're pilgrims. And we're moving towards the heavenly city. This is the city of man. And of course, Augustine's writing in the context of the collapse of Rome.
Yeah.
So we have to understand that the ideas that the Christians had of Rome are the same ideas that we should look at this new Rome that we live under. It's a human system.
Would you say, let me ask you, I don't know about, I'm not really familiar with that time period, but would you say that that the Christians, as they were dealing with the end of the Roman Empire, were the same thing as today with regards to Christians that have always looked at the American Republic as a form of government that was favorable to them? Was that the same thing as it was back then?
So depending on the time, like with the collapse of Rome, so when Rome collapsed around the time that Augustine was writing, Rome had emperors that claimed to be Christian. And like if you read Eusebius of Caesarea, so Eusebius was a big fan of Constantine. In fact, his Ecclesiastical History, which is a classic of Christian theology, Eusebius gives heaping praise on Constantine. It almost sounds like nationalistic fervor when you read him, because he sees Constantine as the fulfillment of the desire of the early fathers, of the apologists and the martyrs. Like, this is what all our work was coming to, was this emperor, and that he was taking things forward. Like, God had established the Roman Empire to rule over men in a human way, and through Christ. So basically they saw Eusebius, as well as, and there's other church fathers who thought this way too, they saw the Caesar and the Roman Empire, the Pax Romana, and the coming of Christ as two very important events in human history that came together in an individual like Constantine. Like, God had ordained that the Roman Empire would come together and unite man in a human way, and that Christ came to help unite man in a spiritual way. And both of these were embodied in the Caesar's becoming Christian with men like Constantine. And what's kind of funny is when you get to Augustine, though, and you see the collapse of the Roman Empire, a lot of that same enthusiasm starts to dissipate, because what Christians had even though I believe Christians were right to try to get the emperor to be Christian. Of course you would. Like if you have a government that, once again, a consequence of sin, a force of nature, pagan origination, of course you're going to try to make it better.
Right.
You want it to be governed by Christians, to be directed by Christians, and you want the church to prosper and be protected and even advanced. So what the reformers and the fathers did by trying to get the government to be Christianized and to advance Christian agendas, there's nothing wrong with that whatsoever. And none of our confessions would say anything against that. Christians can participate in government. They can plead with their rulers to favor the church's desires and needs and to protect the gospel. That's not unquestioned. But the mistake comes in when you look at the government as being something unique and special in God's redemptive purposes. When you look at the state and say, this is the fulfillment of what God's been after, right? But you can't look at any of these types of governments that are a consequence of sin and say that this is God's natural intention for mankind, because it's not the natural intention for mankind.
No, God's natural intention for mankind is, as God said in 1 Samuel, I'm rolling over you.
Yeah, well, or in the garden. Go back to the garden.
back
What was
to the
Adam and Eve dependent upon? They were dependent upon the word of God, right? Man cannot survive on bread alone, but every word, right, that comes from the mouth. I mean, that's the whole point. Is that we
all we
depend
can say
upon
about
God.
human government, in the end, all we can say about human government is that it is a poor substitute for the rule of God.
Yes, and when it comes from an explicitly pagan origin, it's not only that, but it's also nefarious.
Nefarious. Okay.
Well, it was Augustine himself who responded to those who were accusing Christianity as being the very ideology that led to the demise of Rome. Augustine pointed out that no, it was the foundation of Rome was paganism,
Yes.
and that's what eventually led to the demise of
collapse.
Rome.
Correct.
The fact that Christianity, at the end of the day, at the end of Rome's demise, preserved it for a little bit longer.
Yes.
That's not what led to its demise. And the same thing here. Like, the reason that our society is being preserved as long as it has been, and much longer than the French Revolution,
Yes.
okay, is because of Christianity.
Agreed.
There is no other reason.
Yes.
The reason that our society is advanced, all the positive effects in our society have to do with one thing and one thing only, and that is Christian faith.
Yes, because Christianity is the salt of the earth.
This is how invasive the Christian
Amen.
faith is, that Christianity is, you can't even get rid of it. I mean, these people have been trying and trying so hard to get rid of Christianity, and
Anybody
it's
want the rest of
still
that? Yeah.
it's so embedded. It's been so embedded into our culture that they're still trying to get rid of it, but it's still there.
Cheers.
They can't get rid of it. They're not, at the end of the
We got
day.
them on the same page.
At the end of the day, they're not going to be able to get rid of it.
Well, I
They're
think he's
gonna
making
have
a
to-
good point.
it's
I think
gonna
he's
come
making
to
a good
war.
point.
I
I think he's making a good
I
point.
think he's making points that are just outstanding here.
I do.
Yeah.
I think he's right. Because look,
yeah.
Christian, we're salt of the earth, right?
I finally got
salt
him
has
to where I wanted him to be.
what? Wow.
Oh, I'm not sure I like that, but
Here we
okay.
go. There's going to be a brawl. Now, Christianity is salt. We're the salt of the earth, right? And this salt has preserved the systems that we have as long as they have, because remember what we were talking about: is seeking the benefit of the city, restraining the evil that the state could be. Christians have acted in that way. Christians typically support movements in the United States that have restrained the powers of government. Not all the time, but a lot of the time, they've favored restricting oppressive forces. Especially now, Christians have been very much like, hey, we need to have our homeschooling rights. We just don't want to be oppressed. Okay, just leave us alone. Like, we don't want to pay for your abortions and your birth control. We want to be able to homeschool our kids. Just leave us alone. But they're not going to leave us alone, which we know they're not. But at the end of the day, this just reinforces the point that you were making: is that Christians have kind of slowed down the inevitable collapse. But Augustine, that's exactly what he's saying. Augustine, because he's actually dealing with, that wasn't Celsus, no, that's Origen's thing. He's dealing with a pagan author who's criticizing him, saying, like, look, it's you Christians that led to the fall of this Rome, and it was the belief in the pagan gods that sustained it. And you're right. Augustine's like, no, it was paganism that created the Roman Empire, and it was the pagan, and it created the seeds of its own demise, what we've been discussing, right? Mm-hmm. Any democratic system will eventually lead to socialism because the seed's already there. Rome was basically there already. They inflated their currency, they debased it, they had incredible welfare systems,
it's important to understand
debauchery.
before you go on that the reason why the seeds of demise are already there is because of human nature.
Agreed.
Okay.
Agreed, 100%.
Well, yeah, that
Yeah.
should be like
Yeah.
what
But
going
which,
with
well,
Alex
we
saying.
need, there's other people who need
yeah,
to
yeah,
understand.
and
this.
which once again going back
If
to
you
the,
understand that, you have to be kind of an
No,
idiot.
you
I'm
don't.
sorry.
Because there's a lot of people out there.
Like, if you understand your own sinfulness, then I mean,
well, no.
John
No, no.
Michael, there's a lot of people out there that don't understand that. I mean,
Yeah, that's why we,
well,
hey,
the word
that's why
God
we
speaks
preach.
otherwise.
That's why we
Yeah.
preach the gospel.
the word
That's
God
why we
says they're
preach the
living in
gospel.
self-deception. Word God says they're living in self-deception.
They are living.
well,
they are self-deceived.
There's a
but-
lot of people that are living in self-deception.
I agree,
Yeah.
and but
you need to understand that. That's
yeah,
the way
and
it
the
is.
thing is like, yeah, the state is oppressive, and the root is there in human nature. It's inevitable that it would do that, and we are, as Christians, are to pursue the city of God. Because actually, Augustine's one of his objections to the pagan was also that Christians couldn't have possibly led to the demise of the Roman Empire because Christians are indifferent to the Roman Empire. Right. He was saying Christians are after the heavenly city. Well, they're pursuing the city of God. They're not pursuing the city of man.
Yeah, they don't even care
No,
about the
so
Roman
so if
Empire.
Rome collapses, what of it? And that's exactly the point I'm bringing to with our situation here. We're seeing Western governments that are feckless, incompetent, and oppressive, and we're seeing them either collapse or become more tyrannical. And in the face of that, you can't blame Christians for that. You can't blame Christianity or colonialism for any of that thing, because Christianity, at the end of the day, is indifferent to these.
Well,
True Christianity is indifferent to these.
You could say
systems.
this though. You could say Christianity did eventually lead to the fall of Rome. In this, that the teachings of Christianity were so against the original foundings of Rome and the pagan ideology, pagan ideas that founded Rome, that the teachings that led to Rome the disintegration of Rome, which was inevitable.
Yeah, but don't we have to say though that based upon what we said here tonight, that Christianity really had nothing to do with the fall of Rome? Fall of Rome was going to happen.
Yeah,
in
I would
any
agree.
case.
No,
I mean, it
I
was
think so.
inevitable.
Yeah,
It was
I
going
mean,
to happen.
it's
It's going to
inevitable.
happen either way.
The thing is
gonna
that
happen either
all
way.
that Christianity did was prolong the life
Yeah.
of Rome.
Well, it
Yeah.
helped usher Rome into a new age and a better age.
Yeah.
Honestly.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, in the medieval period too, the way the Christians organized society was very decentralized. It was very
it
much
was
more
better.
liberty. Private property was more emphasized. It was better. The medieval system that emerged in Christendom was superior, but you had the continuation of that evil principle in Rome continue in the papacy, and it continued with certain schoolmen and scholastics who continued to preserve the pagan ideas through time. And eventually, at the Renaissance and the Enlightenment, they were resurrected by those secular thinkers who brought all of those ideas back, both the sacrifice of children and
You
the
have been listening
social
to the
contract,
Davis Full
as well
Radio
as
Show.
scientific naturalism.
Like
And
because
subscribe if you enjoyed the content.
Paganism is always rearing its head.
Yeah.
It's always rearing its head. It's always trying to.
And what is
yeah, it's
paganism?
always-
It's the
Satan.
Yeah, it's Satan, but it's the worship of the creature rather than the creator.
Creator, right?
And so and that's always going to emerge
That's
because
always
man
going to
is
emerge.
always going to rebel against God.
Right.
Yep.
Right, exactly.
And so, yeah, and the important thing to sum up for this podcast is knowing where we've come from is going to help us know where we're going. And that's what Christians need to do.
Amen.
Yeah. You have been listening to the Davis Full Radio Show. Like and subscribe if you enjoyed the content.